When we hear the phrase medieval period, most of our minds immediately conjure up the glittering, romanticized scenes fed to us by Hollywood films and high fantasy television shows. We picture brave, chivalrous knights jousting in grand tournaments for the favor of beautiful princesses, poems recited beneath stone balconies, silk dresses billowing in the wind, and endless, passionate love. But when you step into the dark, dusty, and unforgiving archives of the boring History Channel, you are forced to tear down that glamorous curtain and face the muddy, disease-ridden, and highly pragmatic reality that lay beneath. In the Middle Ages, dating and forming a relationship was not about sitting in a cozy tavern sipping ale and trying to get to know someone's personality. It was about preserving territorial integrity, bowing to the oppressive rules of the church, and finding a sturdy pair of hands to help you survive the freezing, famine-stricken winters. Love, if you were incredibly lucky, was a rare luxury that emerged merely out of habit after years of sharing the same pillow, or the same bale of hay. Today we are going to dissect the anatomy of relationships, courtship, and marriage in the Middle Ages. And trust me, this anatomy does not smell very good. Let us begin our examination at the very top of the social hierarchy, the nobility. In the life of a feudal lord or a highborn lady, the word love held absolutely no meaning when compared to a political alliance or a territorial expansion strategy. Among the aristocracy, marriage was essentially a corporate merger. Negotiations between noble families often began when the children were still in their cradles, or sometimes even before they were born. Dowries were meticulously calculated, borderlines were redrawn, and crucial military alliances were forged over the signing of a marriage contract. By the time these noble youths reached the tender ages of 12 or 14, they were married off to individuals who were often much older, and whom they had likely never laid eyes on before the wedding day. Flirting? There is no room for flirting in a political treaty. It was entirely ordinary for couples to meet for the very first time at the church doors. Within this transactional system, the woman's primary and often solely valued duty was to produce a healthy male heir to secure the lineage. The man's duty was to protect his bloodline and his lands. Even the marital bed was rarely a private sanctuary. It was a common and expected practice for the consummation of a noble marriage to be witnessed by attendants, with elder family members sometimes waiting inside the bedchamber, chanting prayers or physically inspecting the sheets. In an environment where romance, privacy, and personal space were absolutely non-existent, seeking emotional fulfillment in a spouse was considered an act of utter foolishness. So, how did the nobility fill this gaping emotional void? This is exactly where the bizarre and highly regulated game of courtly love, amour courtois, enters the historical stage. Popularized in the 12th century, particularly within the French courts of Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter Marie de Champagne, this concept was a brilliant fiction invented by the aristocracy to cure their immense boredom and safely channel their repressed desires. Courtly love was fundamentally an unattainable, deeply agonizing, and strictly platonic romance, usually between a young, unmarried knight and a married lady of higher social standing. The knight would pledge absolute obedience to his lady, shatter lances in tournaments in her honor, wear her handkerchief or ribbon upon his armor, and commission agonizingly long poems about his suffering. The fascinating part is that the lady's husband, the lord of the castle, was usually completely aware of this dynamic and not only tolerated it but encouraged it. Having a wife so beautiful and virtuous that knights wrote poetry about her was considered a massive status symbol for the lord himself. However, the cardinal rule of this game was that the love must never, ever be physically consummated. It was an entire culture built around loving from afar and maturing through suffering. Troubadours, wandering minstrels, traveled across kingdoms singing ballads of these impossible romances, while noble women would literally hold courts of love to hear the complaints of suffering knights and debate philosophical questions such as, can true love exist within a marriage? The general consensus reached by these medieval courts was quite clear. No, love cannot exist in marriage because true love requires free will, and marriage is a mandatory transactional duty. But when we leave the perfumed, silk-draped, and poetic atmosphere of the high courts and descend into the countryside, among the common peasants who made up roughly 90% of the population, the landscape becomes drastically harsher and much more grounded in reality. For the peasantry, marriage was not a political treaty or a matter of aristocratic prestige. In its most primitive form, it was the fundamental building block of a brutal struggle for survival. Serfs and free peasants were looking for highly practical mates. Someone who could work side by side in the muddy fields, milk the cows, bear children to help with the labor, and keep a dilapidated, drafty wattle-and-daub cottage standing during the freezing winter months. Because there were no grand estates to merge, peasants actually enjoyed a slight degree of freedom in choosing their own partners compared to the nobility. But how exactly did flirting occur in the midst of mud, manure, and back-breaking manual labor? The primary venues for peasant socialization and courtship were harvest festivals, spring fairs, village squares, and most importantly, the churchyards. Festivities held after Sunday Mass or during major religious holidays provided the rare opportunities for young people to see each other and express interest. In these festivals, fueled by poorly fermented, cloudy ale, crude songs, and traditional group dances, young peasants would exchange stolen glances, rough laughter, and small, practical tokens of affection. A wooden spoon carved by the boy's own hands, a brightly colored but cheap ribbon, or a freshly picked apple were the most common and accepted flirting gifts a young man could offer to signal his intentions to a girl. Hanging heavy over all of these interactions, however, was the dark, suffocating shadow of the medieval Catholic Church. The Church had established definitive, rigid, and uncompromising rules regarding exactly who could form a relationship, when they could do it, and how it had to be done. For example, the laws of consanguinity, blood relation, were at one point so incredibly strict that marrying anyone related to you within the 7th degree was strictly forbidden. Later, due to sheer logistical impossibility, this was reduced to the 4th degree. In a small, isolated medieval village where outsiders rarely visited and families had intermarried for centuries, finding a legally acceptable spouse whom the Church would approve of was essentially an advanced mathematical problem. Furthermore, the Church dictated the calendar of intimacy. During periods like Lent, Advent, major feast days, and sometimes even on Wednesdays and Fridays, sexual intercourse, even between legally married couples, was considered a grave sin. The clerical establishment viewed sexuality as a necessary evil solely for the purpose of producing new Christians, and deriving any physical pleasure from the act was deemed a demonic weakness and a spiritual disease. Even the culmination of courtship, the wedding ceremony itself, was not the grand indoor spectacle we imagine today. Marriages were generally conducted outside at the church porch. The priest would bless the couple there, the vows would be exchanged in full view of the village community serving as witnesses, and only after the legal and spiritual binding was complete would the couple actually step inside the church. The tradition of the wedding ring existed, but the groom would place it on the bride's right hand, sliding it over 3 fingers in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost before letting it rest on the 4th. Of course, when the darkness of night fell, when the torches were extinguished, and the medieval village was plunged into a profound, terrifying silence, secret meetings and illicit rendezvous in the corners of hay barns certainly took place. Human nature, no matter how heavily repressed by dogma, always finds a way. But indulging in these secret romances carried life-threatening risks. Premarital affairs were severely punished by ecclesiastical courts and led to horrific social ostracization. The village gossip mechanism operated much faster, more ruthlessly, and with far more destructive power than modern social media. A young woman whose reputation was stained had almost zero chance of securing a respectable marriage, effectively condemning her to a life of extreme poverty, starvation, or forcing her to move to a crowded city to survive through prostitution. Therefore, flirting had to be conducted publicly, within the strict boundaries of the community's watchful eyes. Being too intimate was a legal trap. Even holding hands or making promises to one another in public could sometimes be interpreted by the local priest as a formal betrothal, sponsalia, legally binding the two parties together. In fact, if a couple exchanged vows using the future tense, verba de futuro, in front of witnesses and subsequently engaged in sexual intercourse, the Church legally recognized this as a valid, unbreakable marriage. Because of this, the romantic words whispered during medieval flirting carried a dangerous, irreversible legal weight that modern, casual promises do not. We must also address the physical reality of the era. In a time when streets were open sewers filled with mud, rotting garbage, and human waste, and when bathing was an arduous, highly uncommon luxury that happened perhaps a few times a year, the definition of physical attraction was vastly different. Because people believed that deadly diseases like the bubonic plague were spread through bad smells in the air, the miasma theory, those who could afford it carried heavy spices, dried herbs, or scented oils to mask the stench of everyday life. But in a standard peasant courtship, the smell of stale sweat, clothes thick with wood smoke, dirt, and heavy livestock odors were the natural, inescapable backdrop of romance. True beauty and attractiveness were defined entirely by survival metrics. Having an intact set of teeth, a face relatively free of deep smallpox scars, and a sturdy skeletal structure were the height of desirability. For women, wide hips signaled fertility and the ability to survive childbirth, while strong arms meant she could handle a plow. For men, the metrics were equally utilitarian. Possessing the raw muscle power to pull an ox cart out of the mud, being a skilled hunter, or a proficient blacksmith were the factors that determined a man's value in the brutal medieval marriage market. A scrawny, poetic knight reciting verses under a tree might have been fascinating in the gossip of the high courts, but in the freezing, unforgiving reality of a medieval winter, the man who ensured the family didn't starve to death was the filthy, calloused-handed commoner who knew how to slaughter a pig and chop firewood. In conclusion, attempting to date, find love, and build a relationship during those dark and gloomy centuries was an incredibly complex equation of survival instincts, economic desperation, rigid class divides, and uncompromising religious dogmas. In an era where the survival of the community, the preservation of the land, and the continuation of the family lineage completely overshadowed any concept of individuality or personal happiness, living for the sake of love was an impossible luxury. Finding a practical, hard-working partner was a mandatory strategy for staying alive. While modern concepts of romance existed merely as unattainable fantasies echoing in the songs of wandering minstrels within cold castle walls, true love in the real medieval world was something entirely different. It was a quiet, stubborn, and muddy bond that sprouted from mutual suffering, a profound attachment born not from poetry, but from the shared triumph of surviving the darkest and deadliest years of human history side by side. The Middle Ages was not an era for lovers, it was an era for survivors. To understand the true nature of medieval relationships, we must look beyond the priest and the prayer book and enter the murky world of medieval legalities. One of the most fascinating and terrifying aspects of medieval courtship was how incredibly easy it was to get married, often by accident. According to canon law, a marriage didn't require a church, a ring, or even a priest to be legally binding. It only required consent. There were two types of verbal consent: verba de presenti, words of the present, and verba de futuro, words of the future. If a couple stood in a field and said, "I take you as my husband/wife," in the present tense, they were legally married in the eyes of God and the law, right then and there. If they used the future tense, "I will take you," it became a binding marriage the moment they had any form of sexual contact. This led to countless accidental marriages where a bit of whispered sweet-talking in a barn suddenly turned into a lifelong, unbreakable legal contract. For a young man looking for a casual encounter, a few poorly chosen words could result in a local magistrate or priest knocking on his door the next morning to inform him that he was now a family man. This brings us to the tradition of hand fasting. While often romanticized today as a mystical Celtic ritual, in the Middle Ages, it was a practical, semi-formal way of entering a betrothal or a trial marriage. A couple would join hands and make their vows, often in front of witnesses but without a member of the clergy. In many rural communities, hand fasting was considered married enough to begin living together and even starting a family. However, the church spent centuries trying to stamp this out, viewing it as a gateway to sin and legal chaos. The problem with these informal unions was that they were incredibly difficult to prove or disprove. If one partner decided to run away and marry someone else in a different village, the resulting legal battles over pre-contracts could drag on for years in ecclesiastical courts. The medieval dating scene was in many ways a legal minefield where one's words were the most dangerous weapon available. But courtship was never just a private matter between two people. It was a spectator sport for the entire village. In a world where privacy was a luxury of the dead, every move a young couple made was scrutinized by their neighbors. If a relationship was deemed improper, perhaps an old widow was marrying a young man for his labor, or a husband was perceived as being henpecked, the community would engage in a practice known as chivalry or rough music. A mob of villagers would gather outside the couple's house at night, banging pots and pans, blowing horns and shouting lewd insults. They might even force the offending party to ride backward on a donkey through the village. This wasn't just a prank, it was a brutal form of social policing. Relationships had to conform to the community's expectations of order. If you wanted to flirt or marry, you had to ensure your neighbors approved, or you would find yourself the target of a humiliating, cacophonous riot that could last for days. If the village was too small and the church too restrictive, where did a medieval person go to meet someone new? The answer was the pilgrimage. While ostensibly a religious journey to visit the bones of a saint, pilgrimages were the medieval equivalent of a music festival or a singles cruise. As Geoffrey Chaucer famously illustrated in the Canterbury Tales, people from all walks of life, monks, knights, millers and widows, were packed together for weeks on the road. Away from the watchful eyes of their local priest and gossiping neighbors, pilgrims socialized, told bawdy stories and looked for potential partners. The wife of Bath, one of Chaucer's most famous characters, had been married 5 times and went on pilgrimages specifically to scout for her 6th husband. The road to Canterbury or Santiago de Compostela was paved with as much flirtation and opportunism as it was with prayer. It was the only time in a medieval person's life when they could escape their social bubble and meet a stranger from a distant town. However, the most powerful players in the medieval relationship market were not the young maidens or the chivalrous knights, but the widows. In a society where women were legally subordinates to their fathers or husbands, widowhood was the only state that granted a woman true legal and economic agency. A widow inherited a portion of her late husband's land, his workshop, or his trade guild membership. This made her an incredibly attractive catch for young men looking to rise in social status. Unlike a young girl, a widow could negotiate her own marriage contracts, manage her own finances, and choose her next partner based on her own criteria. Many widows chose to stay single to keep their independence, while others used their wealth to buy a younger, stronger husband who could provide the labor they needed. The medieval widow was the CEO of the marriage market, navigating the complexities of law and love with a level of autonomy that was denied to almost everyone else in her gender. Interestingly, the Middle Ages also had a scientific view of love that was far from romantic. Doctors of the time, following the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, viewed lovesickness, amor hurios, as a genuine, dangerous medical condition. It was categorized as a form of melancholy, caused by an imbalance of the 4 bodily humors. If a person became too obsessed with their beloved, it was believed that their brain would literally dry out from the heat of their passion. Symptoms included insomnia, loss of appetite, a pale complexion, and a fluctuating pulse. The cure for this medieval lovesickness was often quite clinical. Doctors recommended better diet, exercise, or in some cases, therapeutic visits to local brothels to expel the excess fluids that were causing the emotional imbalance. Love was not seen as a spiritual height to be achieved, but as a physiological malfunction that needed to be treated before it led to madness or death. For those who could not find love or stability within the strict confines of marriage, medieval cities offered a highly regulated shadow economy of intimacy, prostitution. In many medieval cities, like London or Paris, prostitution was not only legal but was regulated for the public good. Brothels, often called stews, were frequently owned by the church or high-ranking nobility and were concentrated in specific districts, such as Southwark in London. The logic of the medieval authorities was pragmatically cynical. They believed that by providing a legal outlet for male lust, they were protecting virtuous women from being seduced or harassed. Prostitutes were required to wear specific clothing, like a yellow striped hood, to distinguish them from respectable wives. It was a cold, transactional world that stood in stark contrast to the flowery ideals of Soray Ascii, serving as a reminder that for the poor and the marginalized, relationships were often reduced to a matter of coins and survival. Finally, what happened when a relationship failed? In the Middle Ages, there was no such thing as no-fault divorce. Marriage was a sacrament, and what God had joined, no man could put asunder. However, for the wealthy and the desperate, there was the annulment. To get an annulment, you had to prove that the marriage was never valid in the first place, usually by claiming that you were too closely related to your spouse, or that one party had been forced into the marriage against their will, or that a pre-contract existed with someone else. For the common folk who couldn't afford a legal battle in the church courts, the only option was separation from bed and board, a mensa et thura, which allowed a couple to live apart but forbade them from ever remarrying. Many simply chose the poor man's divorce, walking out the door and moving to a town 3 days away, where nobody knew your name or your previous spouse. In a world without ID cards or digital databases, disappearing was the most effective way to end a bad relationship. Middle Ages courtship was a brutal dance between the sacred and the profane. It was a world where a whispered promise could be a legal trap, where a neighbor's pot banging could end your social life, and where the smell of wood smoke and sweat was the true scent of attraction. It was a time when love was rarely the reason for a beginning, but often the only thing that made the long, hard journey toward the end bearable. In the boring history of the human heart, the Middle Ages reminds us that we have always been desperate for connection, even when the world around us was designed to make that connection as difficult and dangerous as possible. To fully grasp the reality of medieval relationships, we must delve into the supernatural side of courtship. When conventional flirting failed, or when a peasant realized their physical charms and agricultural skills weren't quite enough to secure a mate, they frequently turned to the illicit and highly condemned practice of love magic. The church preached that marriage should be built on mutual consent and divine grace, but the common folk often preferred a more direct, pragmatic approach: witchcraft, charms, and potions. Court records from the Middle Ages are practically overflowing with cases of men and women brought before ecclesiastical judges for attempting to manipulate the affections of another through supernatural means. A popular, albeit stomach-churning, method involved sympathetic magic utilizing bodily fluids. It was a widely held belief that if a woman kneaded dough on her bare skin, particularly while sweating, or baked a loaf of bread containing a drop of her own blood, and then fed it to the man she desired, he would become hopelessly and aggressively infatuated with her. Men were equally guilty, often purchasing expensive love philters from local cunning folk or apothecaries. These potions contained a bizarre mix of ingredients, ranging from the mundane, like crushed periwinkle and honey, to the absurd and dangerous, such as pulverized animal hearts, mandrake root, and even filings from a church bell. The sheer volume of these court cases proves that the medieval dating scene was driven by an intense desperation. People were willing to risk the wrath of the Inquisition and the literal fires of hell just to ensure they didn't have to face the freezing winter alone. Once the love magic worked or the practical negotiations concluded, the wedding day arrived. We previously discussed the cold, legalistic vows exchanged on the church porch, but the aftermath of those vows was an entirely different spectacle. For the peasantry, the wedding feast, often called the bride ale, from which the modern English word bridal derives, was a rare opportunity for unbridled gluttony and intoxication. Because the couple usually didn't have the funds to host a massive party, the bride ale functioned much like a modern fundraiser. The bride would brew a massive batch of ale, and the villagers would pay a premium to drink it, with the profits going to the newlyweds to help them start their household. It was loud, chaotic, and aggressively bawdy. But the community's involvement didn't end when the ale ran out. It extended all the way into the bedroom. The bedding ceremony was not exclusively an aristocratic nightmare. Even among the common folk, it was customary for the wedding guests to escort the bride and groom to their bedchamber, which was often just a curtained-off section of the main room or a loft above the livestock. The guests would strip the couple, make crude jokes, sing fertility songs, and physically tuck them into bed. Sometimes, the crowd would linger outside the door, banging pots and demanding proof that the marriage had been consummated. The concept of a private, romantic wedding night is a modern invention. In the Middle Ages, ensuring that a new family unit was properly and physically established was considered the business of the entire village. When the hangover faded and the guests finally went home, the harsh reality of medieval domesticity began. Legally speaking, a married woman entered a state called coverture. Under common law, a woman's legal identity was entirely absorbed by her husband upon marriage. She could not own property in her own name, she could not sue or be sued, and any money she earned belonged legally to him. He was the baron, and she was his femme. From a modern legal perspective, it was a relationship defined by absolute subjugation. However, the day-to-day reality of a peasant household often demanded a much more egalitarian partnership than the law books suggested. A medieval farm could not function if the husband was a tyrant and the wife was merely a passive servant. Survival required a highly synchronized division of labor. Generally, the man was responsible for the heavy plowing, cutting timber, and dealing with the legal affairs of the manor, while the woman managed the dairy, brewed the ale, tended the vegetable garden, raised the poultry, and spun cloth. Yet, these gender roles were highly porous when necessity dictated. During the crucial harvest weeks, or if the husband fell ill, women worked the fields swinging scythes right alongside the men. If a marriage was to succeed, it had to be a well-oiled economic machine. The romanticized idea of the frail, delicate wife waiting for her husband to return from the fields simply did not exist among the peasantry. A woman who couldn't carry her own weight was a liability that a medieval household could not afford. This delicate economic partnership, however, was often overshadowed by the brutal reality of domestic discipline. The medieval legal system explicitly granted a husband the right to correct his wife physically. It was considered his moral duty to ensure her good behavior, much as a parent was expected to discipline a child. Treatises from the era casually advised men to beat their wives if they gossiped too much, ruined the dinner, or showed disrespect. But this right to violence was not absolute. The community and the church drew a line between reasonable correction and deadly cruelty. If a man beat his wife so severely that he broke her bones, drew excessive blood, or threatened her life, the wife could, and sometimes did, appeal to the ecclesiastical courts. Furthermore, the village community had its own ways of policing domestic tyranny. If a man was known to be excessively brutal, or conversely, if a woman was known to physically dominate her husband, the village would once again deploy the chivalry, or rough music, publicly shaming the household until the accepted social order was restored. The medieval marriage was a hierarchy, but it was a hierarchy held in check by the watchful, judgmental eyes of the neighbors. While we examine the rigidly structured heterosexual marriages that formed the backbone of the medieval economy, we must also address those who fell entirely outside this accepted paradigm. What about same-sex relationships in the Middle Ages? Officially, the Church categorized homosexual acts under the broad and terrifying umbrella of sodomy, viewing it as a crime against nature that warranted severe punishment, often death by burning. Consequently, finding explicit, joyful accounts of same-sex relationships in medieval archives is exceedingly rare. People learned to hide in the deep shadows of society. However, the history of human affection cannot be completely erased by legal codes. We find traces of these relationships in court records, where individuals were prosecuted for living together unnaturally. We also find it in the intense, highly emotional letters exchanged between monks or between nuns within the cloisters. The monastic life, ironically, provided a somewhat safe haven for same-sex attraction. In a society strictly segregated by gender within religious orders, passionate, intimate friendships flourished. While theologians insisted these were purely spiritual bonds, the language used in these surviving letters, filled with declarations of undying love, physical longing, and deep emotional dependency, often closely mirrors the language of romantic courtship. These individuals carved out spaces of deep affection in a world that officially denied their existence. Finally, every medieval relationship, whether it was a pragmatic peasant partnership, a noble political alliance, or a hidden romance, operated under the constant, looming shadow of death. Life expectancy was brutally short, plagued by famine, warfare, childbirth complications, and disease. Serial monogamy was incredibly common. A person might be widowed and remarried 3 or 4 times in their lifetime. Consequently, the ultimate test of a medieval relationship was not how the couple lived, but how they prepared to part. A good death was a massive cultural obsession. When a spouse lay dying, the partner's duty was to remain by the bedside, orchestrating the final prayers, ensuring the priest delivered the last rites, and protecting the dying person's soul from the demons believed to be lurking in the corners of the room. Furthermore, love and obligation extended beyond the grave through the drafting of wills. Husbands would carefully stipulate the widow's bench or free bench, ensuring their wives had the legal right to remain in the family home and be supported by the heirs until her own death. Wealthy couples would commission elaborate joint tombs, carving their stone effigies holding hands, a physical, eternal declaration of the bond they shared. In the end, the most profound expression of medieval love was not a poem or a stolen kiss, but the desperate, hopeful act of praying for a spouse's soul, trusting that the brutal, muddy, and exhausting partnership they shared on earth would finally find its peaceful reward in the eternity of the afterlife. To truly dissect the anatomy of medieval relationships, we must first shatter one of the most pervasive and resilient myths regarding the era: the idea that everyone was married off the moment they hit puberty. Because of the nobility's obsession with securing political alliances through child marriages, modern pop culture has broadly assumed that a typical medieval village was entirely populated by married 13-year-olds. The boring, demographic reality is completely the opposite. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants, the artisans, and the urban laborers, marriage at a young age was an economic impossibility. Historical records, particularly from the later Middle Ages in Western Europe, reveal that the average age of marriage for commoners was remarkably similar to our own today. Women typically married in their early to mid-20s and men in their mid to late 20s. Why the delay? Because in the medieval peasant and artisan classes, you could not marry until you could afford to establish an independent household. You needed a cottage, a plot of land, agricultural tools, or the capital to open a workshop. And acquiring these things took years of grueling, poorly compensated labor. This economic bottleneck created a widespread social phenomenon known as life cycle service. Around the age of 12 or 14, both boys and girls were routinely sent away from their family homes to work as servants, dairy maids, or apprentices in the households of slightly wealthier neighbors, merchants, or guild masters. They lived, worked, and slept in the homes of strangers for up to a decade, saving their meager wages to build a dowry or buy a piece of land. Consequently, this period of servitude became the true hidden battlefield of medieval courtship. Away from the strict supervision of their own parents, young men and women found themselves living in incredibly close quarters with other hormonally charged youths. The kitchens, the dairies, the harvest fields, and the cramped attic sleeping spaces of merchant houses became hotbeds of unsupervised flirtation. Court records are flooded with testimonies of apprentices seducing maidservants in the pantry, or farmhands whispering promises of marriage to milkmaids behind the barn. Because these young people had no property, their courtship was entirely based on physical proximity, shared labor, and spoken promises. However, this freedom came with catastrophic risks. If a maidservant became pregnant during her term of service, she was usually fired immediately, cast out into the streets without a reference, and left to face the brutal social and economic consequences of being an unwed mother in a deeply religious society. The young man involved often simply denied everything, or fled to another town to avoid paying the mandatory financial support ordered by the church courts. When a young commoner finally managed to scrape together enough resources to seriously propose marriage, the courtship required a tangible exchange of tokens. The material culture of medieval dating was deeply symbolic, yet inherently cheap. Since peasants did not possess gold or jewels, they relied on items that demonstrated practical skill or required a small but meaningful financial sacrifice. A young man might spend his evenings carving a wooden busk, a stiff piece of wood used to shape a woman's bodice, intricately decorating it with hearts or geometric patterns. Presenting this to a woman was an intimate gesture, as the busk would be worn close to her body. Another common token was the bending of a silver penny. A couple would take a coin, physically bend it in half, and each keep a piece as a vow of their betrothal. For the slightly more affluent urban classes, the posy ring became the ultimate symbol of affection. These were simple bands of silver or base metal, engraved on the inside with short, standardized poetic inscriptions, usually in French or Latin. Phrases like "Mon cœur est vague," "You have my heart," or "Amor vincit omnia," "Love conquers all," were incredibly popular. However, these tokens were not just romantic gifts, they were legal evidence. If a betrothal was broken off, the return of these tokens was a matter of fierce legal dispute. Ecclesiastical courts spent an absurd amount of time listening to angry ex-lovers argue over who had the right to keep a cheap brass ring, a linen handkerchief, or a pair of knitted gloves. If a woman kept the ring, the man could legally argue that she had accepted his promise of marriage, effectively using the cheap trinket to trap her in a binding contract. Therefore, accepting a gift from a suitor in the Middle Ages was not a casual flutter of the heart. It was the acceptance of a terrifying legal liability. In the cramped, bustling environment of the medieval city, romance was even more deeply entangled with commerce. For an artisan or a craftsman belonging to a guild, marriage was the ultimate career move. A journeyman baker, blacksmith, or weaver could not easily become a master of his guild and open his own shop without a wife. Running a medieval business required a two-person team. While the husband worked the forge or the ovens, the wife managed the storefront, handled the incredibly complex finances, haggled with suppliers, and oversaw the apprentices. Therefore, a young artisan wasn't looking for a muse, He was looking for a competent business partner with a head for numbers and a sharp tongue for negotiating. This dynamic led to one of the most common and pragmatically unromantic relationship tropes of the medieval city: the apprentice marrying the master's widow. When a guild master died, his widow inherited the shop, the tools, and the right to continue the trade. She instantly became the most eligible bachelorette in the neighborhood. A smart, ambitious apprentice would quickly move to marry her, regardless of the age difference. For the widow, it meant keeping the business running with a young, capable worker she already knew. For the apprentice, it meant instantly bypassing years of financial struggle to become the master of the shop. It was a perfectly calculated, mutually beneficial transaction wrapped in the guise of holy matrimony. In the urban marriage market, love was quite literally a trade agreement. But what happened when the pragmatism failed and the eye wandered? Infidelity in the Middle Ages was not merely a personal betrayal. It was a devastating threat to the entire social and economic fabric. In a society where property, land, and trades were passed down strictly through bloodlines, the legitimacy of heirs was paramount. If a peasant left his life's work, his plow, his oxen, his meager acres, to his son, he needed absolute certainty that the child was actually his. Therefore, female adultery was treated with a level of paranoia and hostility that bordered on the psychotic. It was the ultimate theft, stealing a man's lineage. This societal paranoia gave rise to the era's greatest insult and most profound fear: becoming a cuckold. The term derives from the cuckoo bird, which notoriously lays its eggs in the nests of other birds, forcing them to raise its young. A man whose wife was unfaithful was universally mocked as a cuckold, and it was considered the absolute destruction of his masculine honor. Medieval literature, fabliaux, bawdy comedic tales, and church marginalia are obsessed with the figure of the cuckold, often depicting him wearing literal animal horns on his head. The community did not just punish the cheating wife, they ruthlessly humiliated the victimized husband for failing to control his household. Punishments for adultery were public, theatrical, and deeply shaming. A cheating spouse might be heavily fined, whipped, or subjected to public penance, forced to walk through the town square barefoot, wearing nothing but a white sheet, holding a lit candle, while the neighbors jeered and threw rotting vegetables. The goal was not just spiritual correction, but the complete, terrifying destruction of a person's social standing. Yet, despite this oppressive atmosphere of legal traps, economic desperation, and public humiliation, the very end of the Middle Ages saw the faint, bizarre beginnings of what we now consider modern romance. In the late 14th century, poets like Geoffrey Chaucer began to experiment with the idea of associating romantic love with specific dates on the calendar. In his poem, The Parliament of Fowls, Chaucer linked the feast day of an obscure early Christian martyr, Saint Valentine, with the time of year when birds supposedly chose their mates. The upper echelons of society, always desperate for new ways to alleviate their boredom, seized upon the idea. Aristocrats began sending each other written valentines, poems expressing affection and devotion. Of course, the peasants knee-deep in freezing mud, struggling to survive the tail end of the Black Death, cared absolutely nothing for Saint Valentine or poetic birds. But it was the microscopic seed of a cultural shift. It was the very beginning of the long, slow process where the transactional, survival-driven, and legally terrifying reality of medieval relationships would eventually be buried beneath layers of paper hearts, commercialized romance, and the enduring illusion that love, rather than land, was the foundation of human connection. We have navigated the legal traps of verbal consent, the desperation of love magic, the economic transactions of the urban marriage market, and the public humiliation of the cuckold. But to fully understand the life cycle of a medieval relationship, we must confront its ultimate, inescapable objective: reproduction. A marriage, no matter how politically advantageous or economically sound, was considered a failure if it did not produce children, specifically male heirs. But the journey from the wedding bed to the cradle was arguably the most terrifying and lethal phase of a medieval woman's life. When a woman went into labor, she entered a realm entirely segregated by gender. The birthing room was an exclusively female domain. Husbands, doctors, and priests were strictly banished. The windows were shuttered, keyholes were stuffed with cloth to keep out evil spirits, and the room was plunged into a sweltering, claustrophobic darkness. The process was overseen by a midwife, an older, experienced woman of the village whose medical knowledge was a potent, often suspicious, mixture of practical herbalism and deep-rooted superstition. Because childbirth was so incredibly dangerous, with maternal mortality rates unimaginably high by modern standards, the atmosphere was one of profound dread. It was standard practice for a woman to write her last will and testament the moment she realized she was pregnant. To ease the agonizing pain of labor, the midwife might use eagle stones, bind the woman's thighs with parchment inscribed with the names of saints, or lay a heavy birthing girdle across her abdomen. In royal households, these girdles were highly coveted holy relics, often claimed to be pieces of the Virgin Mary's own clothing, rented out by monasteries for exorbitant fees. If the labor went wrong, if the child was breech or the mother began to hemorrhage, there was virtually no surgical recourse. The relationship between husband and wife was put to its most agonizing test as the man paced outside the door, knowing that the agonizing screams echoing from the chamber could very well end in the death of his spouse, his child, or both. If the woman survived the ordeal, she was not met with immediate celebration, but with a period of intense isolation. According to the strict doctrines of the medieval church, the act of giving birth rendered a woman spiritually polluted. For 40 days following the birth of a male child, and up to 80 days for a female child, reflecting the deep-seated misogyny of the era, the mother was forbidden from entering the church, partaking in communion, or even resuming sexual relations with her husband. She was required to remain in her home, completing a period of confinement. This period officially ended with a ceremony known as the churching of women. The mother would walk to the church door, often carrying a lighted candle, where she would be met by the priest. He would sprinkle her with holy water, recite psalms of purification, and formally welcome her back into the congregation. Only then was the marital relationship allowed to resume its normal course. While modern historians debate whether women viewed churching as an oppressive shaming ritual or a welcome, protected holiday from their exhausting agricultural and domestic duties, it firmly underscored the Church's belief that human reproduction was inherently stained by original sin. But what happened when this terrifying reproductive process occurred outside the sacred Church-sanctioned boundaries of marriage? The result was the creation of the medieval outcast, the bastard. Illegitimacy was a massive social and legal stain. Under common law, an illegitimate child was deemed filius nullius, a child of no one. They had no legal right to inherit their father's name, his land, or his titles. In the harsh reality of the peasant village, a bastard child was often viewed as a horrific economic burden. Single mothers were frequently dragged before the church courts, fined heavily for the sin of fornication, and subjected to brutal public penances. The father, if he could be identified, was ordered to pay maintenance, but many men simply vanished into the next county to avoid the financial drain. However, the stigma of bastardy varied wildly depending on your social class. While a peasant bastard faced a life of crushing poverty and social exclusion, noble bastards lived in a strange, gray area of privilege. Kings and high-ranking lords frequently acknowledged their illegitimate offspring, raising them at court and granting them lesser titles or prominent positions within the church. William the Conqueror, who successfully invaded England in 1066, was widely known as William the Bastard. In the upper echelons of society, the pragmatic need for loyal blood relatives often overrode the strict moralizing of the church, proving once again that medieval morality was highly flexible for those who held the gold and the swords. Speaking of the church's moralizing, we must pivot to the messy, hypocritical love lives of the very men who were making all these rigid rules: the clergy. In the 11th and 12th centuries, the Gregorian reforms violently pushed the doctrine of clerical celibacy, demanding that all priests, monks, and bishops remain entirely chaste. But human nature is a stubborn thing. In reality, thousands of medieval priests lived in open, long-term relationships with women. These women were known as focarii, or hearthmates. To the community, they functioned exactly as wives. They managed the priest's household, cooked his meals, and bore his children. In many rural villages, the congregation actually preferred their priest to have a concubine, believing it meant he would be less likely to seduce their own wives and daughters. The church hierarchy periodically attempted to crack down on this widespread clerical concubinage, issuing furious edicts, threatening to excommunicate the priests, and ordering the women to be seized and sold into slavery. Yet, local bishops often turned a blind eye, preferring to simply charge the priests a yearly concubine tax, collegium, to enrich the diocesan coffers. The medieval parish was a place where the priest might passionately preach against the sins of the flesh on Sunday morning, only to return home to his hearthmate and their 3 children in the afternoon. Even for couples who adhered strictly to the rules, who married legally and remained faithful, stability was never guaranteed. In an era defined by constant warfare, relationships were frequently torn apart by geography. The Crusades in particular created a unique demographic of grass widows, women whose husbands had taken the cross and marched off to the Holy Land. A crusade could easily last 5 to 10 years, and mortality rates from battle, dysentery, and starvation were catastrophic. The women left behind were forced into an agonizing state of legal limbo. They had to manage the estates, defend the castles from greedy neighbors, and raise the children, all while not knowing if they were wives or widows. The church dictated that a woman could not remarry until she had absolute, definitive proof of her husband's death, a nearly impossible requirement when the body was rotting in the sands of the Levant. Some women waited decades. It is here that we must completely debunk one of the most famous, enduring myths of medieval relationships, the chastity belt. The idea that a crusading knight would lock a metal contraption around his wife's pelvis to prevent infidelity before riding off to war is entirely a fiction invented by Victorian historians and Renaissance satirists. There is absolutely no contemporary medieval evidence, either archaeological or textual, that such devices were ever used. Medically speaking, wearing a rusted iron cage against bare skin for 5 years in the medieval period would have resulted in lethal infections within weeks. The myth survives because it perfectly encapsulates the modern obsession with medieval brutality and male control, but the boring historical truth is that crusaders relied on the threat of divine punishment, the watchful eyes of their relatives, and the devastating social consequences of female adultery to keep their wives faithful while they were away. But what happened when a marriage degraded into a state of violent, irreconcilable hatred, and the church absolutely refused to grant an annulment? In some specific regions, particularly within the Holy Roman Empire and Germanic territories, couples could resort to the most bizarre and extreme form of relationship counseling ever devised: divorce by combat. This was a legally sanctioned judicial duel specifically for husband and wife to settle insurmountable domestic disputes. To account for the physical disparity between the sexes, the rules were highly specific and deeply strange. The husband was placed in a waist-deep hole dug into the ground, severely limiting his mobility, and was armed with a wooden club. The wife was allowed to move freely around the edge of the hole and was armed with a heavy rock tied inside a long cloth sleeve or veil. They would fight, often to the death or until one party submitted. If the husband won, the wife could be buried alive. If the wife won, the husband could be executed. It was a brutal, gladiatorial spectacle that stripped away all the poetic veneer of courtly love, reducing the marital bond to a literal fight for survival in a pit of dirt. From the suffocating darkness of the birthing room to the hypocrisy of the priest's hearth, from the agonizing weight of the crusader's wife to the blood-soaked dirt of the marital duel, the reality of medieval relationships was a crucible. It was a world where human connection was forged not by romance, but by the relentless, crushing pressures of economics, law, religion, and mortality. They loved, they hated, they betrayed, and they mourned just as we do, but they did it while balancing on a razor's edge where one wrong word could trap them in a miserable contract, and one bad harvest could starve their family to death. In the boring, dusty pages of history, their stories remind us that love in the Middle Ages was not a fairy tale, it was a desperate act of endurance. To fully complete our autopsy of medieval relationships, we must examine how these fragile human bonds reacted to the greatest apocalyptic event in recorded history, the Black Death. When the bubonic plague swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, it eradicated anywhere from 1/3 to half of the population. While this was a demographic catastrophe of unimaginable proportions, it paradoxically created a bizarre, temporary golden age for the survivors, drastically altering the dynamics of the marriage market. Before the plague, Europe was chronically overpopulated. Land was scarce, wages were abysmal, and young people had to wait years in servitude to afford a marriage. Suddenly, the plague emptied the farms and the workshops. There was a massive surplus of land and a desperate shortage of labor. For the common medieval woman, this demographic shift was revolutionary. Because laborers were in such incredibly high demand, women were able to command significantly higher wages in agriculture and urban trades. They were no longer entirely dependent on rushing into a marriage simply to avoid starvation. This newfound economic leverage meant that women could afford to be much more selective about their partners, or they could choose to delay marriage indefinitely, living independently as spinsters or alewives, women who brewed and sold beer. The post-plague era saw a sudden spike in marriages as survivors rapidly coupled up to inherit the newly vacant lands, but it also saw a profound, albeit temporary, shift in the balance of power. For a brief window in history, the desperate pragmatism that defined peasant courtship was softened by the luxury of choice and economic independence. However, for the aristocracy, the desperation to secure land and wealth remained as vicious as ever, leading to one of the most dramatic and legally complex relationship strategies of the era: marriage by abduction. In medieval legal terminology, the Latin word raptus was frequently used, but in secular courts, it did not exclusively carry its modern definition of physical assault. In the eyes of the law, raptus was primarily viewed as a crime of property theft, specifically the theft of a woman from her father, her husband, or her feudal lord, because the woman represented a massive transfer of wealth and land. For a younger son of a noble family, who would inherit absolutely nothing due to the strict laws of primogeniture, where the eldest son takes the entire estate, the future was bleak. One high-risk, high-reward solution to this poverty was to literally kidnap a wealthy heiress. These abductions were often highly organized raids where a band of armed men would snatch a noble woman from her manor or her carriage. The goal was to force a hasty marriage, usually consummated immediately, making the union legally binding and incredibly difficult for her furious family or the church to annul. Once married, the abductor gained the legal right to manage all her lands through the laws of coverture. Incredibly, historical evidence suggests that in many of these cases the abduction was actually a staged elopement. If a young heiress was secretly in love with a landless knight but knew her father would never consent to the match, she might arrange her own kidnapping. It allowed her to marry the man she chose while saving face. She could claim she was forced into the union, thus directing her family's wrath toward the legal complexities of the act rather than her own blatant disobedience. It was a chaotic, legally murky world where kidnapping was utilized as an aggressive, calculated tactic in the aristocratic dating scene. When the fires of youth faded, whether they had married for love, land, or through staged abductions, medieval couples eventually had to face the grim reality of old age. In a society without state pensions, retirement homes, or social security, what happened to a peasant couple when their bodies finally broke down from decades of brutal manual labor? They could not simply stop working. To stop working was to starve. The solution was a highly formalized, legally binding retirement contract, sometimes known as a maintenance agreement or a carity. When a peasant father realized his back was failing and he could no longer grip a plow, he would officially transfer the tenancy of his land to his adult son or son-in-law. But this transfer came with incredibly strict, legally enforceable stipulations. The contract, recorded meticulously in the manor court rolls, would dictate exactly what the younger generation owed the elderly couple in exchange for the farm. These lists were exhaustive and highly specific. A typical contract might demand that the son provide his parents with a specific room in the house, often the warmest room near the hearth, a set number of bushels of wheat and barley per year, a certain amount of firewood, new woolen coats every winter, and a specific daily allowance of ale. These retirement contracts reveal a deeply unsentimental, highly pragmatic view of familial love. Medieval parents did not trust the natural affection of their children to keep them alive. They trusted the crushing weight of the manorial legal system. If the son and his new wife failed to deliver the agreed-upon firewood, or if they tried to skimp on the quality of the grain, the frail, elderly parents would drag their own children before the local magistrate to sue them for breach of contract. The end of a medieval marriage, if both partners were lucky enough to survive into old age, was often spent in a tense, litigious standoff with their own offspring, clinging desperately to a legal document to ensure they wouldn't freeze or starve in the corner of the house they had built. Yet, amidst all this crushing pragmatism, legal warfare, and economic desperation, we must acknowledge that genuine, profound human affection did exist, and occasionally, it defied the entire system. We know this because of the survival of the Paton letters, a massive collection of correspondence from a prominent English family in the 15th century. The letters between Margaret Paton and her husband John reveal an arranged marriage that blossomed into a fiercely loyal, highly effective partnership. While John was away in London fighting endless legal battles, Margaret managed their estates, defended their manor against armed sieges, and wrote to him with a mix of sharp business updates and deep, abiding affection, referring to him as her right worshipful husband, and begging him to return home safely. But the most telling story from the Pathan archives is that of their daughter, Marjorie. In 1469, Marjorie committed the ultimate act of medieval rebellion. She fell in love with the family's bailiff, Richard Caillé. Caillé was a salaried employee, socially far beneath her station. Her family was utterly horrified. Margaret, the mother who so fiercely loved her own husband, completely disowned her daughter, forbidding anyone in the household from speaking to her. The family dragged the young couple before the Bishop of Norwich, hoping to use their massive political influence to have the betrothal shattered. But Marjorie stood before one of the most powerful men in England and calmly, stubbornly repeated the verba de presenti, the binding legal words of present consent. She told the bishop that she had pledged her soul and her body to Richard, and she would not break that vow, no matter the cost. Despite the vast wealth and fury of the Pathan family, the church had to concede to its own laws. The marriage was valid. Marjorie was cast out of her family, losing her wealth, her inheritance, and her status, choosing to live in obscurity as the wife of a glorified accountant. Marjorie Paston's defiance serves as the perfect conclusion to our autopsy of medieval relationships. The boring history of the Middle Ages is a chronicle of arranged corporate mergers, brutal domestic hierarchies, oppressive church dogmas, muddy churchyard flirting, and chilling legal contracts. It was a massive, unforgiving machine designed to prioritize survival, land acquisition, and lineage over the desires of the individual human heart. And yet, the machine was never perfect. Beneath the heavy layers of wool, mud, and canonical law, people were still inherently human. They whispered legally binding promises in the dark, they risked the literal fires of hell for a charlatan's love potion, they fought their children in court for a warm place by the fire, and occasionally, they threw away entire fortunes just to stand beside the person they chose. The medieval relationship was an exhausting, lifelong battle for survival, but in the quiet, undocumented moments between the struggles, it was often the only warmth they had. To fully comprehend the mechanics of a medieval marriage, we must strip away the legal documents and church edicts and step directly into the physical space where these relationships actually played out: the home. Modern romantic ideals rely heavily on the concept of privacy. A closed door, a quiet room, a space dedicated entirely to the couple. In the Middle Ages, particularly for the peasantry and the urban working class, the concept of spatial privacy was not just non-existent, it was physically impossible. The typical medieval peasant dwelling was a cruck house, or a simple wattle and daub cottage consisting of a single multi-purpose room. There were no hallways, no separate bedrooms, and usually no glass in the windows. In the center of the room sat the hearth, an open fire that provided heat, light, and a cooking surface, while filling the unventilated, windowless space with a constant, suffocating layer of wood smoke. Within this dark, smoky, and crowded square footage, the most critical piece of furniture, and the absolute epicenter of the marital relationship, was the bed. For a peasant family, a proper wooden bed frame with a stuffed mattress was often the single most expensive item they would ever own in their entire lives. It represented a massive financial investment. When we look at medieval wills and household inventories, beds and bedding are meticulously itemized and bequeathed with the same gravity that modern people use to pass down real estate. But this prized possession was rarely a private sanctuary for the husband and wife. Because heating a medieval cottage in the dead of winter was incredibly difficult, body heat was a vital survival resource. The great bed was often shared by the couple, their infant children, and sometimes even a highly valued servant or apprentice. For the poorer classes who slept on straw pallets on the dirt floor, they frequently shared their sleeping space with valuable livestock, pigs, chickens, or a prized milk cow, brought indoors to protect them from wolves and the freezing cold. How, then, did a medieval couple maintain any semblance of physical intimacy? The answer lies in the psychological compartmentalization of darkness. In an era before artificial lighting, nightfall brought an absolute pitch-black darkness that modern people rarely experience. The darkness itself acted as a physical barrier, a psychological curtain. Medieval couples learned to conduct their intimate lives in absolute silence, mere inches away from sleeping children, snoring farmhands, and restless animals. Intimacy was an incredibly brief, stealthy, and pragmatic act, completely devoid of the prolonged, candlelit romance depicted in modern fiction. It was an act executed in the pitch black, under heavy woolen blankets, driven by the dual engines of biological imperative and the desperate need to generate heirs, all while hoping the apprentice sleeping at the foot of the bed didn't wake up. Beyond the bed, the daily survival of the relationship hinged on a strictly enforced, highly stressful division of caloric labor. We have established that a medieval marriage was a survival partnership, but the specific mechanics of this partnership revolved entirely around food and drink. In a world where municipal water supplies were frequently contaminated with agricultural runoff and human waste, drinking plain water was a dangerous gamble. The primary source of hydration for everyone, including children, was small ale, a weak, fermented grain beverage that was safer to drink because the brewing process killed off lethal bacteria. The monumental task of producing this vital lifeblood fell almost exclusively to the wife. In the medieval village, women dominated the brewing industry. The wife was the brewster, and her ability to brew a consistent, drinkable batch of ale directly dictated the health and hydration of her entire household. If a wife was particularly skilled at brewing, she could sell the surplus from her kitchen, bringing in crucial supplementary income for the marriage. However, this commercial aspect placed the marital relationship under intense public and legal scrutiny. Medieval towns employed officials called ale conners to test the quality of locally brewed ale. If a wife was caught brewing sour ale, watering down her product, or shortchanging her customers, the consequences were severe. She could be heavily fined, financially crippling her husband, or she could be subjected to the cucking stool, a wooden chair in which she was publicly dunked into the local river or a muddy pond while the village jeered. A husband whose wife was publicly humiliated for bad brewing suffered a massive blow to his own social standing. Therefore, the domestic harmony of a medieval household was permanently tethered to the quality of the barley, the temperature of the fermentation, and the strict municipal laws governing the wife's kitchen. This dietary stress was further compounded by the liturgical calendar. The modern concept of hanger, being angry due to hunger, is a minor inconvenience compared to the medieval reality of mandatory fasting. The Catholic Church dictated that roughly 1/3 of the year consisted of fasting days. This included the 40 days of Lent, the period of Advent, the eves of major feast days, and typically every Wednesday and Friday. On these days, the consumption of meat, animal fats, and sometimes dairy was strictly forbidden. For a peasant husband who had spent 14 hours swinging a scythe in the freezing mud, coming home to a meager meal of salted fish, stale bread, and boiled beans was a recipe for intense domestic friction. The wife had the thankless task of trying to construct a meal that adhered to the terrifying laws of the church, utilizing the incredibly limited ingredients available in a winter pantry, while trying to placate a physically exhausted, calorie-starved husband. The medieval kitchen was a pressure cooker of religious obligation and biological necessity, and the relationship often bore the brunt of that tension. Furthermore, we must address the suffocating presence of the extended family. The nuclear family, just a husband, wife, and their children, was a rarity. Because of the aforementioned retirement contracts, carities, a newlywed couple almost always shared their cramped living space with the husband's aging parents. This created a notoriously explosive dynamic, particularly between the new bride and her mother-in-law. In the medieval domestic hierarchy, the senior woman held the keys to the pantry and the lockboxes, a literal and symbolic representation of absolute domestic power. When a young woman married into the household, a brutal, silent war of attrition often began over who truly controlled the hearth. The younger woman was expected to do the heavy physical labor of the household, but the older woman retained the authority to manage the stores and dictate the daily routine. Manor court records are littered with petty lawsuits and violent domestic disturbances stemming from multi-generational friction, proving that the dreaded mother-in-law trope is not a modern sitcom invention, but a deeply rooted historical trauma born from the claustrophobia of the medieval cottage. Outside the walls of the home, the relationship was visually policed by the crown through sumptuary laws. In a highly stratified society, a person's clothing was their identity card. As the middle class of merchants and wealthy artisans began to rise in the later Middle Ages, they attempted to show off their newfound wealth by buying expensive clothes for themselves and their wives. The aristocracy, horrified that a successful baker's wife might look indistinguishable from a duchess, enacted strict laws dictating exactly what fabrics, colors, and furs a person could wear based on their husband's income and social class. For example, A man whose income was under 40 shillings a year was legally forbidden from buying his wife any fabric that cost more than 2 shillings a yard, and she was absolutely prohibited from wearing any silk, silver embroidery, or ermine fur. If a husband wanted to spoil his wife with a luxurious velvet gown as a token of his affection or a display of his commercial success, he was risking massive fines and the confiscation of the garments. The royal government literally dictated the romantic gifting habits of the population, ensuring that the visual hierarchy of the kingdom was not disrupted by upwardly mobile husbands trying to impress their spouses. Finally, we must touch upon the most absolute, terrifying boundary in medieval relationships: interfaith mingling. While we have discussed the intense difficulties of finding a partner within the same village and the same religion, stepping outside of the Christian faith was a guaranteed death sentence. Medieval Europe was not a monolith. There were significant populations of Jewish communities, and in places like Spain and Sicily, large Muslim populations. However, the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 established horrifyingly strict segregation laws. It mandated that Jews and Muslims wear distinctive identifying clothing, such as specific badges or pointed hats, specifically to prevent accidental romantic or sexual mingling with Christians. A Christian who engaged in a romantic or sexual relationship with a Jew or a Muslim was not just committing a sin, they were committing a capital crime. The punishments were unspeakably brutal, often involving public burning at the stake for the heretic, and castration or execution for the Christian. There was no Romeo and Juliet across religious lines in the Middle Ages. There was only absolute terror and the rigid enforcement of a purely segregated society. Love, in its most desperate and transgressive forms, was entirely crushed by the heavy, blood-stained machinery of religious intolerance. The anatomy of a medieval relationship is a study in claustrophobia. They loved in the dark, surrounded by the sleeping bodies of their extended family and their livestock. They maintained their households under the terrifying threat of the cucking stool, the fasting calendar, and the watchful eyes of the ale conner. They navigated the treacherous waters of multi-generational power struggles over pantry keys, and they dressed according to the strict, legislated dictates of a paranoid aristocracy. Every facet of their affection, their intimacy, and their daily survival was heavily regulated, deeply public, and fraught with peril. Yet, amidst the smoke, the stale ale, and the suffocating laws, these partnerships formed the unshakable bedrock of human history, proving that the desire to build a life with another person is resilient enough to survive even the darkest, dirtiest, and most boring centuries imaginable. To truly understand the darkest and most invasive mechanisms of medieval relationships, we must step inside the cold, stone walls of the consistory courts. These were the ecclesiastical tribunals where the messy flesh and blood realities of human intimacy collided with the unforgiving bureaucratic machinery of canon law. When a medieval marriage irrevocably broke down, the couple could not simply sign a piece of paper and part ways. Because marriage was a sacred, unbreakable sacrament, the only way out was an annulment, proving that the marriage was entirely invalid from the very first day. While claims of consanguinity, being too closely related, or pre-contracts with another person were common legal loopholes, the most deeply humiliating and bizarre avenue for an annulment was the claim of impotence. According to medieval theology, the primary purpose of marriage was procreation, and the secondary purpose was the payment of the marital debt, the mutual obligation to provide sexual access to one another to prevent the sin of lust. If a husband was physically incapable of consummating the marriage, the contract was technically void. But the church courts did not simply take a frustrated wife's word for it. They required absolute, physical, and often highly public proof. If a woman sued for annulment on the grounds of her husband's impotence, the court would subject the man to a terrifyingly invasive process. The judge would appoint a jury composed of honest matrons, usually elderly, respected women of the community, or in some documented urban cases, local prostitutes who were considered experts in male anatomy. The husband would be taken into a private room, sometimes placed in a warm bath to supposedly aid his circulation, and these women would physically examine him. They would manually attempt to stimulate him to determine if he was capable of achieving an erection. The court scribes would then meticulously record the women's testimonies in the official Latin ledgers, detailing the exact physical state of the man's anatomy. The wife would also be subjected to physical examinations by midwives to prove that her seal of virginity remained intact after months or years of cohabitation. For a medieval man whose entire social standing and patriarchal authority rested on his physical capability and dominance, this public trial was the ultimate destruction of his honor. The medieval legal system treated the bedroom not as a private sanctuary, but as a heavily regulated public utility subject to forensic inspection by the neighbors. If the couple was biologically functional, their relationship was still entirely dependent on a fragile foundation of material goods, specifically the dowry or marriagium. Modern portrayals often depict dowries as heavy iron chests overflowing with gold coins, exchanged between plotting kings. But for the vast majority of the population, the dowry was a desperate, heartbreaking collection of basic survival tools. A peasant girl's dowry might consist of a single brass cooking pot, a worn woolen blanket, a wooden chest, and perhaps half a dozen chickens or a sickly calf. This meager collection of items was the absolute prerequisite for courtship. A girl without a dowry, no matter how physically attractive or hardworking she was essentially unmarriageable. This created an atmosphere of ruthless litigious warfare between families. If a father promised a certain number of sheep in a betrothal agreement but failed to deliver them on the wedding day, the new husband would not hesitate to drag his father-in-law to the manor court. The new bride would find herself trapped in a bitter legal feud between the man she just married and the family that raised her. Furthermore, the dowry served as the woman's only primitive form of life insurance. While the husband controlled her assets during the marriage under the laws of coverture, if he died, the widow was legally entitled to the return of her original dowry, plus her dower, usually a one-third interest in his lands for the rest of her life. The medieval marriage market was fundamentally a crude insurance policy, negotiated with livestock and brass pots, designed to prevent a woman from starving to death when her husband inevitably succumbed to dysentery or an infected wound. Because economic survival was entirely dependent on making a good marriage, a person's reputation was their most valuable financial asset. In a world without credit scores, bank accounts, or background checks, your entire worth was calculated by what your neighbors said about you. Therefore, gossip was not just idle chatter. It was a lethal economic weapon. If a jealous neighbor or a spurned suitor started a rumor that a young woman was unchaste, or that she had secretly exchanged verba de presenti vows of consent with another man, her marriage prospects were instantly vaporized. No pragmatic medieval peasant would risk marrying a woman whose reputation was tainted, fearing the legal backlash of a hidden pre-contract or the social humiliation of raising another man's bastard. Consequently, the medieval church courts were absolutely choked with defamation lawsuits. Women who were legally barred from participating in most aspects of public life used defamation suits as a fiercely aggressive tool to defend their social and economic standing. If someone called a woman a whore or a thief at the village well, she would haul them before the bishop's court. These trials were incredibly petty, loud, and revealing. If the accuser could not prove their slander, they were forced to perform a highly humiliating public penance. They would have to stand at the front of the parish church on a Sunday, during the most crowded mass, holding a wax candle, and publicly confess that they had lied, begging the victim and the community for forgiveness. In the medieval dating scene, a sharp tongue could destroy a life, but an aggressively defended reputation was a shield of armor. Yet, even with all these watchful neighbors, invasive courts, and rigid contracts, the sheer lack of centralized record-keeping created a massive, chaotic loophole in medieval relationships: bigamy. Without a national database, a marriage certificate, or even a photograph, a person's identity was completely fluid outside of their immediate village. If a peasant marriage grew unbearably abusive, or if a man simply wanted to escape crushing debt or a barren wife, he possessed the ultimate ghosting tool. He could literally just walk away. He could travel 50 miles down the road, adopt a new surname based on his trade, like John the Smith or William the Baker, claim he was a bachelor, and marry a completely different woman. The church courts were constantly dealing with the chaotic fallout of medieval bigamy. It was not uncommon for a woman to be married to a man for 10 years, raising his children and running his farm, only for a strange, ragged woman to arrive in the village one afternoon, claiming to be his lawful first wife from a town 3 counties over. Because the church recognized the first validly contracted marriage above all others, the second marriage was instantly rendered null and void, regardless of how long it had lasted or how many children it had produced. The second wife would be instantly stripped of her status, her children declared bastards, and the husband forced to return to the original spouse he had abandoned a decade prior. The medieval marriage was theoretically an unbreakable iron chain, but in reality, it was often severed simply by putting on a pair of walking boots and disappearing into the dense forests of the 14th century. Finally, we must return to the urban centers to examine how the authorities capitalized on those who fell completely outside the boundaries of lawful marriage. We touched upon the regulated brothels, but the sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of the medieval sex trade requires a deeper look, specifically in the district of Southwark in London. Because Southwark lay just across the River Thames, outside the legal jurisdiction of the City of London, it became a massive entertainment and vice district. But the brothels here, known as the stews, were not run by rogue criminals. They were licensed, regulated, and taxed directly by the church, specifically by the incredibly powerful Bishop of Winchester. The women who worked in these church-owned brothels were colloquially known as Winchester geese. The bishop's officials wrote meticulous rules for the management of these relationships. A prostitute could not be forced to work if she was pregnant, she could not be overcharged for her food by the brothel keeper, the bawd, and she was strictly forbidden from working on holy days or during church hours. The church profited massively from the rent collected from these establishments, utilizing a deeply cynical theological justification. They argued that just as a palace needs a cesspit to collect the filth so the rest of the building smells sweet, a city needs brothels to collect male lust so that the virtuous wives and daughters remain untouched. However, the church's pragmatic tolerance ended at the grave. Despite paying taxes to the bishop and living under his strict regulations, the Winchester geese were officially excommunicated. When they died, they were denied a Christian burial. They could not be laid to rest in the consecrated ground of the parish churchyards. Instead, their bodies were dumped into an unconsecrated, mass burial site known as the Crossbones Graveyard, without prayers or headstones. It is the ultimate, grim summation of medieval relationship dynamics. The authorities heavily regulated human intimacy, profited immensely from its desperate transactions, and then callously discarded the individuals involved into the mud, ensuring that the rigid, hypocritical hierarchy of the Middle Ages was preserved not just in life, but for all eternity. To fully comprehend the mechanics of medieval relationships, we must confront the hidden, desperate, and highly criminalized world of medieval family planning. We have established that the primary church-sanctioned purpose of marriage was procreation. However, in the harsh economic reality of the peasant village, unchecked fertility was a death sentence. If a family living on a marginal plot of land already had 5 mouths to feed, the arrival of a 6th child could tip the entire household into starvation during a bad harvest. Therefore, despite the terrifying threats of damnation from the pulpit, medieval couples engaged in a constant, frantic struggle to control their own reproduction. Because barrier methods as we know them did not exist, the burden of contraception fell entirely upon the woman and the local network of female knowledge. This was the domain of the cunning folk, or village healers, who passed down oral traditions of herbal abortifacients and contraceptives. Plants like pennyroyal, savon, mugwort, and rue were widely known to induce menstruation or terminate early pregnancies. The church was acutely aware of this underground reproductive economy and fought a relentless war against it. Medieval penitentials, handbooks utilized by priests to guide confessions and assign penances, are absolutely obsessed with the microscopic details of contraceptive magic and herbalism. Priests were instructed to interrogate women in the confessional, asking directly if they had consumed potions of sterility, if they had jumped up and down after intercourse, or if they had worn specific amulets made of weasel testicles, a bizarrely common folk contraceptive, to prevent conception. Engaging in these acts was classified as a grave sin, often equated with homicide, and carried severe penances, such as years of fasting on bread and water. Yet, the sheer volume of these warnings in ecclesiastical texts proves exactly how widespread the practices were. For a medieval peasant woman, the immediate visceral terror of watching her existing children starve to death frequently outweighed the abstract, theological fear of purgatory, forcing the most intimate aspects of a relationship into the realm of criminal secrecy. This desperate attempt to control biology was further complicated by the bizarre medical theories of the era regarding human sexuality. Medieval medicine was entirely governed by the Galenic system of humors, which dictated that the human body was filled with 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, that needed to remain in perfect balance. According to this science, both men and women produced seed, and both were required to release this seed through orgasm for conception to occur. However, the medical establishment also believed that if a woman did not engage in regular marital intercourse, her unreleased seed would putrefy within her body, leading to a terrifying medical condition known as suffocation of the womb, or the wandering womb. Doctors genuinely believed that the uterus was an independent, almost animal-like organ that could detach itself and wander up into the chest cavity if it was starved of sexual activity, causing the woman to choke, faint, or descend into hysterical madness. Therefore, the marital debt, the obligation to have sex with your spouse, was not just a religious duty. It was prescribed by physicians as a vital, life-saving medical treatment to keep the wife's internal organs firmly anchored in place. Because the stakes of the marital bed were so incredibly high, encompassing medical health, legal validity, and the production of heirs, it became the focal point for intense societal paranoia and magical sabotage. The greatest fear of any medieval couple on their wedding night was the curse of ligature, or the tying of the points. It was a universally held superstition that a jealous ex-lover, a spurned suitor, or a malicious witch could render the groom completely impotent simply by tying a knot in a piece of leather cord or a thread while the couple was exchanging their vows at the church door, and then hiding that knotted cord or tossing it into a river. As long as the knot remained tied, the groom's biological functions would remain magically tied. This wasn't a fringe belief, it was treated as a legitimate legal and theological crisis. Renowned theologians wrote extensive treatises on how to combat ligature, and church courts heard countless annulment cases where the husband blamed his physical failures entirely on a hidden magical knot. To prevent this, weddings were often fraught with paranoid rituals. Grooms would wear their clothes inside out, couples would thoroughly sweep the bedchamber looking for hidden threads, and priests would sometimes bless the marital bed with holy water to banish any lingering spells of impotence cast by resentful neighbors. If a couple navigated the magical sabotage, the medical terrors, and the perilous childbearing years, their relationship was still statistically likely to end abruptly in premature death. While we have extensively discussed the power and agency of the medieval widow, we must also examine the frantic, chaotic reality of the medieval widower. When a peasant woman died in childbirth, a tragically common occurrence, she left behind a husband who was immediately thrust into a catastrophic logistical crisis. A medieval man could not plow the fields, chop firewood, repair the thatch roof, and simultaneously nurse an infant and tend to toddlers. The rigid division of labor meant that a household without a woman simply ceased to function. Therefore, a widower with young children did not have the luxury of a prolonged mourning period. He was forced back into the marriage market almost immediately, often marrying a domestic servant, a local spinster, or a younger widow within mere weeks or months of his first wife's funeral. The romantic notion of a man remaining eternally faithful to the memory of his lost love was an aristocratic luxury. For the working class, immediate remarriage was a desperate survival tactic. This frantic cycle of death and rapid remarriage turned the typical medieval household into a highly volatile, complex web of blended families. A single cramped cottage might house a husband, his second wife, the children from his first marriage, the children from her first marriage, and the new children they produced together. This environment was the historical crucible that forged the enduring cultural trope of the wicked stepmother. In a society where resources were agonizingly scarce, a new wife was biologically and economically incentivized to prioritize the survival of her own biological children over the children of the first wife. When the winter food stores dwindled, or when the father finally died and his meager acres had to be divided, the internal household politics turned vicious. Manor court records are filled with brutal lawsuits between first bed and second bed children fighting over an inherited brass pot, a rusted plowshare, or a quarter acre of barley. The medieval home was frequently a battleground of competing bloodlines, where a relationship born out of pragmatic necessity resulted in generations of bitter, litigious resentment among step-siblings fighting for the scraps of their parents' labor. Finally, we must acknowledge that in the desperate struggle to survive the Middle Ages, not all domestic partnerships were based on heterosexual marriage. In certain regions of medieval Europe, particularly in rural France and the Mediterranean, the legal system provided a fascinating alternative to marriage known as affreurement, brother-making. This was a legally binding, contractual union between two unrelated men who agreed to merge their lives and assets. The two men would stand before a notary or a priest, swear an oath on a Bible or holy relics, and pledge to share one bread, one wine, and one purse. They moved into a single household, pooled their agricultural labor, shared their financial debts, and most importantly became each other's legal heirs. While modern historians debate the exact nature of these relationships, whether they were purely pragmatic economic mergers to survive heavy taxation, or legally sanctioned covers for romantic same-sex couples, the mechanics of the affirmment functioned exactly like a marriage. The men were legally bound to support one another through sickness and old age, and the surviving partner inherited the entirety of the joint estate, entirely bypassing the claims of distant blood relatives. The church and the state permitted these unions because they stabilized the rural economy, ensuring that abandoned farms were worked and taxes were paid. It is a striking reminder that the rigid, oppressive structure of medieval society occasionally produced highly pragmatic, legal loopholes. Whether driven by deep emotional attachment or cold, calculated agricultural survival, the affirmment proves that when the traditional marital structure failed or was unattainable, medieval people simply invented alternative ways to bind themselves together against the crushing darkness and poverty of their era. Fully map the bleak, transactional landscape of medieval relationships, we must examine what happened when the biological machinery of the marriage finally worked, and an infant was introduced into the household. In modern romanticized views, the arrival of a baby solidifies the bond between husband and wife, creating a cozy, loving family unit. In the Middle Ages, however, childbirth triggered a complex, heavily regulated biological economy that frequently severed the physical and emotional ties between mother and child, specifically among the upper classes. This was due to the medieval medical understanding of breast milk and its direct conflict with the marital debt. According to the prevailing Galenic medical theories, breast milk was not a distinct bodily fluid. It was believed to be menstrual blood that had been magically transmuted and purified by the heat of the woman's body. Furthermore, medical texts and theological treatises uniformly agreed that sexual intercourse would dangerously heat the mother's blood, spoiling her milk and potentially poisoning the nursing infant. Consequently, the Church mandated absolute celibacy for a woman while she was lactating. Because medieval women typically nursed their children for up to 2 years, this created a massive logistical problem for aristocratic marriages. A noble husband could not afford to wait 2 years to resume sexual relations. His primary duty was to produce multiple spares, to ensure his bloodline survived the horrific infant mortality rates of the era. The solution to this biological bottleneck was the outsourcing of motherhood, the wet nurse economy. Aristocratic and wealthy urban women almost never nursed their own children. Instead, they hired peasant women to perform the biological labor. This allowed the noblewoman's body to recover quickly, effectively restarting her menstrual cycle so she could immediately return to the marital bed to conceive the next heir. For the peasant woman, however, this was a grim transaction. To be a wet nurse, she had to be lactating, which meant she had recently given birth herself. Because a woman generally could not produce enough milk to sustain 2 infants, she was often forced to wean her own child dangerously early onto a nutritionally deficient diet of animal milk and pap, bread soaked in water, or hand her baby over to a cheaper, lower-quality nurse. The peasant baby frequently died so that the aristocratic baby could thrive. The medieval marriage of the nobility was a relentless reproductive factory, and it operated by literally purchasing the breast milk and the biological resources of the poorest women in society, completely detaching the romanticized concept of motherhood from the physical reality of raising a child. This profound physical detachment at the highest levels of society reached its absolute, bizarre zenith in the practice of marriage by proxy. When royal families negotiated international alliances, the bride and groom were often separated by thousands of miles, hostile borders, and treacherous oceans. A marriage treaty signed on paper was never considered entirely secure. It could easily be broken or repudiated by rival political factions. According to canon law, a marriage was only truly, irreversibly binding once it had been physically consummated. But how do you consummate a marriage when the bride is in Spain and the groom is in England? The medieval legal system invented a highly clinical, theatrical fiction. The groom would send a trusted ambassador or a high-ranking nobleman to the bride's country to act as his physical stand-in. A grand wedding ceremony would take place, with the ambassador speaking the verba de presenti on behalf of his king. But the truly strange part occurred later that evening during the bedding ceremony. In front of a room full of witnesses, lawyers, and clergy, the bride would get into the marital bed. The ambassador, representing the groom, would step up to the bed. In some traditions he remained fully dressed in his armor or court robes. In others he stripped down to his undergarments. He would then slip one bare leg beneath the heavy woolen blankets and physically touch his bare flesh against the bride's leg. Once skin-to-skin contact was made and witnessed by the notaries, the marriage was declared legally and physically consummated by proxy. The ambassador would withdraw his leg, the treaty was locked in, and the bride would begin her months-long journey to meet a husband she had never seen, secure in the knowledge that she was now legally bound to him through the brief, awkward touch of a diplomat's shin. If we step away from these cold, aristocratic legal fictions and return to the bustling medieval cities, we find a much more visceral, physical landscape for courtship and intimacy: the public bathhouse. It is a persistent myth that medieval people never bathed and lived in a constant state of absolute filth. In reality, during the 13th and 14th centuries, major urban centers like Paris, London, and various German cities boasted thriving networks of public bathhouses, known as stews or bagnos. Because heating water at home was incredibly expensive and labor-intensive, the bathhouse was a vital municipal utility. But it was also the ultimate medieval social club. Inside, men and women frequently bathed together in massive, wooden, steam-filled tubs. Attendants served roasted meats and spiced wine on wooden boards floating directly on the water. In a society so rigidly policed by the church and neighborhood gossip, the bathhouse offered a rare, intoxicating atmosphere of physical proximity and sensory indulgence. It was the premier location for urban flirting, illicit affairs, and casual encounters. However, the line between a municipal hygiene facility and a brothel was paper-thin. Many bathhouses offered private rooms for an extra fee, and the term stew eventually became synonymous with a house of prostitution. For a brief period, the medieval city offered a remarkably open, communal space for physical mingling. But this era of steamy, communal intimacy came to a horrific, permanent end in the late 1490s with the outbreak of the Great Pox, the disease we now know as syphilis. Brought back by the crews of early explorers or mutating from existing European strains, the medieval iteration of syphilis was vastly more aggressive and terrifying than its modern counterpart. It caused massive, weeping ulcers, the literal rotting away of flesh from the face, and agonizing death. Because the medical community quickly realized it was transmitted through sexual contact and the shared, warm waters of the stews, a wave of absolute terror swept across Europe. The authorities rapidly shut down the bathhouses, bricking up their doors. The arrival of the Great Pox violently altered the landscape of human relationships, replacing the communal, flirtatious atmosphere of the urban bath with a deep, puritanical paranoia about the physical body and the lethal consequences of casual intimacy. If disease was the terror that ended relationships, barrenness was the terror that prevented them from fulfilling their primary medieval purpose. If a marriage failed to produce children, the blame was universally, medically, and theologically placed entirely on the woman. A barren wife was considered a failure in the eyes of her husband, a useless asset to her family, and cursed by God. When the herbal potions of the cunning folk failed, desperate medieval couples turned to the massive, highly lucrative economy of fertility tourism, the relic trade. The landscape of Europe was dotted with shrines dedicated to specific saints who supposedly held power over the womb, most notably Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth. Women desperate to save their marriages would embark on grueling pilgrimages. The practices at these shrines were a bizarre blend of fervent piety and desperate magic. Women would pay exorbitant fees to monks to drink water mixed with the dust scraped from a saint's tomb. They would purchase holy girdles, strips of parchment or silk that had supposedly touched a sacred relic, and bind them tightly around their waist during intercourse. One of the most haunting practices was measuring. A barren woman would take a spool of waxed thread and physically measure the exact circumference of the church or the shrine. She would then use that massive length of thread to commission a single gigantic candle, which would be left burning at the altar as a beacon of her desperation. The medieval economy heavily exploited the biological panic of married women, turning their desperate need to conceive into a massive revenue stream for the monastic orders. Finally, we must observe what happened when these biological failures collided with the highest levels of geopolitical power. When a peasant marriage was barren, they suffered in quiet poverty. When a royal marriage was barren, it resulted in a terrifying public spectacle of forensic annulment. The most infamous example is the trial between King Louis XII of France and Queen Joan of France in 1498. Louis desperately needed to marry the widow of the previous king to keep the wealthy territory of Brittany under the French crown. To do this, he had to dispose of Joan, his wife of 22 years. Because Joan had not produced a male heir, Louis appealed to the Pope for an annulment, utilizing a devastatingly cruel legal strategy. He publicly claimed that Joan was physically deformed, that he had been coerced into the marriage by her father, and most shockingly that in 22 years of sharing a bed, he had never been able to physically consummate the marriage because of her repulsive nature. Joan, displaying incredible resilience, fought back. She publicly testified under oath that they had indeed consummated the marriage, stating exactly how many times it had happened, and calmly offered to submit to an invasive physical examination by midwives to prove her capability to bear children. The Pope appointed a commission of cardinals to literally interrogate the King of France about his sexual performance, asking him detailed questions about his anatomy and his bedroom habits in front of a court of lawyers. In the end, political bribery triumphed over anatomical truth. The Pope granted the annulment, allowing Louis to secure Brittany, while Joan was banished to a convent. This grotesque public trial perfectly encapsulates the reality of the medieval relationship. At its core, it was never about romance, privacy, or mutual respect. It was a brutal, pragmatic mechanism. Whether it was a peasant fighting for a brass pot, an ambassador sliding his leg under a blanket, or a king publicly humiliating his wife of 2 decades for a piece of land, love in the Middle Ages was always subservient to the cold, hard, and utterly boring dictates of survival, law, and power. We must now dismantle perhaps the most infamous, sensationalized myth of medieval relationships, popularized by countless Hollywood movies and historical novels: the jus prime noctis, or the rite of the first night, often referred to as droit du seigneur. The cinematic image is deeply ingrained in our modern culture. A wicked, tyrannical feudal lord arrives on horseback at a peasant wedding, invoking his ancient legal right to take the virgin bride back to his castle and deflower her before her new husband is allowed to touch her. It makes for excellent cinematic drama and paints a picture of absolute aristocratic villainy, but in the dusty, meticulous ledgers of the boring History Channel, it is an absolute fabrication. There is not a single piece of credible legal, historical, or administrative evidence that any such rite was ever codified or systematically practiced in medieval Europe. It was largely a myth invented by later Renaissance and Enlightenment writers to make the Dark Ages look as barbaric and backwards as possible. However, the boring truth is that the feudal lord was deeply and intrusively involved in his peasants' sex lives and marriages, but he didn't want the bride's virginity, he wanted her money. In the brutal economics of the manorial system, a peasant was essentially considered the property of the estate. If a serf's daughter married a man from a different manor and moved away, her lord permanently lost a valuable piece of biological machinery, a worker and a future producer of more workers. To compensate for this loss of human livestock, the lord demanded a heavy tax known as the merchet. A peasant father had to pay this extortionate fee simply to obtain the lord's permission to give his daughter away. Furthermore, lords actively policed peasant chastity through an entirely different fine called the leerwite. If an unmarried peasant woman was discovered to be pregnant, or known to be engaging in premarital relations, she or her family was dragged before the manor court and fined. The lord didn't care about the state of her immortal soul. He cared that her damaged reputation might lower her marriageability, thereby threatening his future merchet tax. The feudal system literally monetized peasant sexuality, turning virginity and marriage into highly taxable commodities that filled the local barons' coffers. Because the financial and social stakes of marriage were so terrifyingly high, couples frequently attempted to bypass the oppressive system through clandestine marriages. As we established earlier, all it took to form an unbreakable legal bond was the verba de presenti, words of present consent. But what happens when one person claims the sacred words were spoken in secret, and the other furiously denies it? The ecclesiastical courts, often colloquially known as the body courts, due to the scandalous nature of their caseloads, were entirely reliant on human witness testimony. This desperate need for proof turned the medieval village into a paranoid landscape of amateur spies and eager eavesdroppers. Court records from the 14th and 15th centuries are overflowing with testimonies from villagers who went to absurd, almost comedic lengths to secure legal leverage over a couple. Witnesses testified under oath that they had hidden behind ale barrels in dark taverns, crouched in thorny bushes outside barns, or pressed their ears against thin wattle-and-daub walls just to hear a young man whisper, "I take thee as my wife." Friends would be deliberately planted in adjacent rooms during a romantic rendezvous, tasked with listening for the specific Latin or vernacular legal phrasing required to lock the couple into a contract. The medieval dating scene was a high-stakes surveillance state. A casual, drunken promise whispered in a dark orchard could easily result in a bishop's subpoena months later, with your neighbor gleefully testifying that he had been hiding in the apple tree the entire time, taking mental notes of your exact phrasing. If a woman managed to successfully navigate the manorial taxes, the village spies, and the deadly perils of the birthing bed, she might achieve the ultimate, paradoxical prize of medieval womanhood. She might outlive her husband and become a wealthy widow. In popular culture, the merry widow is depicted as a liberated, joyful woman, finally free from the oppressive yoke of male authority, happily spending her late husband's gold. While widowhood did grant unprecedented legal agency, allowing a woman to make her own will, sign contracts, and manage property without a male guardian, it was rarely a peaceful or merry existence. A wealthy widow was viewed by medieval society as a dangerous anomaly, a glitch in the patriarchal matrix that needed to be rapidly corrected. From the moment the husband was buried, a ticking clock began. According to the Magna Carta and customary law, a widow was granted the widow's quarantine. She had the absolute right to remain in her deceased husband's principal house for exactly 40 days without being harassed. But on the 41st day, the vultures descended. If she lived in a city and inherited her husband's lucrative guild membership or workshop, the pressure was relentless. The urban guilds, entirely dominated by men, were deeply uncomfortable with a woman running a major business independently. They frequently enacted aggressive bylaws forcing a widow to either step down, surrender the business to a male apprentice, or remarry within a single year. She instantly became the target of aggressive, relentless courtship from younger, ambitious journeymen who viewed her not as a romantic prospect, but as a winning lottery ticket. The medieval widow was essentially under permanent economic siege, forced to sleep with one eye open to protect her assets from predatory suitors, greedy in-laws, and a civic government desperate to force her back under the legal control of a new husband. As we dig deeper into the court archives, we occasionally find stories that completely shatter the rigid, binary, and heavily regulated mold of medieval relationships, proving that human sexuality and gender expression have always been vastly more complex than the church edicts suggest. One of the most extraordinary documents to survive from the Middle Ages is the 1395 interrogation record of an individual arrested in London, who lived and worked entirely across gender lines. Born biologically male and known in earlier life as John Reichener, this individual was arrested while working as a female prostitute under the name Eleanor. The court records present a stunningly detailed, matter-of-fact account of Eleanor's life. She confessed to dressing in women's clothing, learning the female trade of embroidery, and working as a sex worker in taverns, dark alleys, and even right outside the gates of major churches. What makes the Reichener case so fascinating for the study of medieval relationships is the sheer diversity of Eleanor's clientele. She testified to having sexual encounters with a vast array of medieval society: foreign merchants, local artisans, and most scandalously numerous priests, monks, and friars. Eleanor explicitly noted that members of the clergy were her best-paying customers. Furthermore, the court documents reveal that Eleanor also had sexual relationships with women, including former nuns. The Reichener case completely short-circuits the standard historical narrative. In a society that supposedly punished any deviation from strict heterosexual, procreative marriage with fire and brimstone, Eleanor Reichener managed to live, work, and build intimate, albeit transactional, relationships as a cross-dressing sex worker in the heart of England's largest city. The fact that the city magistrates were so baffled by her case that they didn't even know exactly which specific laws to charge her under, ultimately focusing more on her deceit and the crime of prostitution rather than her gender expression, shows that the rigid medieval legal system was entirely unequipped to handle the messy, fluid reality of human desire. Finally, to understand how medieval people processed the intense, overwhelming emotions of love and grief in a world so heavily governed by sudden death, we must look at the highest form of romantic gifting among the ultra-rich, the Book of Hours. These were personalized, heavily illuminated prayer books that served as the ultimate medieval status symbol. But they were also profoundly intimate relational objects. A wealthy nobleman would commission a book of hours for his new bride, spending an absolute fortune to have the margins decorated not just with saints, but with their intertwined initials, their family coats of arms, and sometimes even hidden, coded messages, romantic mottos, or private jokes painted in gold leaf into the borders. Because these books were held daily, pressed against the chest, and sometimes kissed during private prayer, they became the physical embodiment of the marital bond. When a spouse died, the surviving partner would often continue to use the book, meticulously adding the dates of their loved one's death to the calendar pages, turning a romantic wedding gift into a highly portable, beautiful mausoleum of grief. This visceral, literal connection to the physical remains of love extended to the bizarre aristocratic practice of separate heart burial. If a king, queen, or great lord died far from home, or if they wished to physically divide their loyalty between two places, they would order their bodies to be butchered upon death. The corpse would be buried in one location, while the heart was surgically extracted, embalmed in heavy spices, encased in a lead or silver casket, and transported hundreds of miles to be buried next to a deceased spouse or in a favored monastery. It was the ultimate literal expression of giving someone your heart. In a society where marriages were so often cold, calculated business mergers driven by land and law, the act of ordering your own chest cavity to be cracked open so your heart could rot alongside your partner's remains proves that beneath the boring, oppressive legalities, a fierce, terrifying, and deeply human romanticism still violently beat within the medieval chest. As we continue to dissect the deeply unromantic anatomy of medieval relationships, we must strip away the modern billion-dollar wedding industry's aesthetic and look at the brutal financial reality of the medieval marriage ceremony itself. If you were a peasant, your wedding day was not the happiest day of your life. It was a high-stress, high-stakes crowdfunding event. The modern concept of the pristine white wedding dress is an entirely Victorian invention, designed to flaunt the wealth required to buy a garment that could only be worn once and was impossible to clean. A medieval peasant bride wore her best dress, a garment she likely spun, wove, and sewed herself. It was not white. It was the color of whatever cheap natural dye she could forage or afford, perhaps a faded woad blue, a dull madder red, or simply the undyed coarse brown of the local sheep. This dress would not be preserved in a box in the attic. It would be worn to church every Sunday, to every local festival, and likely serve as her burial shroud when she died. The wedding feast, as previously touched upon, was the bid ale. The couple did not provide a lavish free meal for their guests out of the goodness of their hearts. They provided the venue and the home-brewed ale, and the guests were socially obligated to bid or pay for their drinks and food at highly inflated prices. The entire purpose of the wedding reception was to extract enough surplus capital from the local community to buy a plowshare, a few bushels of seed grain, or a milk cow. If the village was suffering from a poor harvest and the guests did not drink enough, the new couple would start their marriage in catastrophic, life-threatening debt. Once the crowdfunding was complete and the couple retired to their smoky, crowded cottage, they were immediately met with the suffocating, microscopic regulations of the church regarding their sexual conduct. We have established that the church viewed sex purely as a procreative necessity, but the sheer, bureaucratic depth of their obsession with the marital bed is staggering. The ecclesiastical authorities produced massive volumes known as penitentials, essentially highly detailed instruction manuals for priests to use during confession. These manuals contained exhaustive lists of specific sexual acts and the corresponding penances, usually years of fasting on bread and water, required to cleanse the soul. The church explicitly mandated that sexual intercourse could only occur in one specific position, utilizing the bizarre theological logic that anything else was a deviation from nature, and therefore a grave sin that disrupted the divine order. Furthermore, it was widely preached that the couple should not look at each other's naked bodies, as the sight of flesh might incite unholy lust, rather than the solemn, grim duty of procreation. Because following these rules perfectly was practically impossible, the medieval marital bed was an engine of perpetual guilt. The church essentially ensured that every married couple was in a constant state of low-level sin, requiring them to constantly return to the priest for confession, thereby cementing the church's absolute psychological authority over the most intimate moments of human existence. However, the church was not the only entity policing the bedroom. The the village community enforced its own deeply ingrained, highly aggressive patriarchal standards. We previously discussed the chivalry, or rough music used to punish unpopular marriages, but this mechanism was also deployed with vicious enthusiasm against couples who inverted the accepted gender hierarchy. In the medieval mindset, the household was a microcosm of the kingdom. The husband was the king and the wife was the subject. If a wife was known to physically beat her husband, or even if she was simply perceived as being too loud, too argumentative, or wearing the trousers in the relationship, the community viewed this not just as a private domestic issue, but as a dangerous subversion of the natural order that threatened the stability of the entire village. The punishment was the skimming ton ride, or riding the stang. The village mob would seize the husband, not the wife, but the husband who had failed to control her. They would force him to sit backward on a donkey or straddle a long wooden pole, the stang, parading him through the muddy streets while beating pots and pans and throwing refuse at him. The community publicly humiliated the victim of the domestic abuse because his inability to dominate his wife made him a failure as a medieval man. The medieval village cared absolutely nothing for a husband's emotional well-being or physical safety. They cared only that the rigid, oppressive structure of male supremacy was violently maintained. To escape this oppressive, judgmental panopticon, desperate individuals often resorted to the subterranean world of folk magic, utilizing methods that perfectly highlight the grotesque, unsanitary reality of medieval romance. While we previously touched upon the use of love potions, we must examine the specific, deeply unsettling logic behind them. The medieval mind believed strongly in sympathetic magic, the idea that the physical essence of a person could transfer their emotional state to another. This resulted in an absolute obsession with bodily fluids. One of the most common, widely documented folk spells to secure a person's love involved an apple. A young woman or man would take a freshly picked apple and place it deep into their armpit, keeping it there for several days while they engaged in heavy manual labor. The goal was to saturate the porous skin of the apple entirely with their sweat. They would then offer this sweat-soaked fruit to the object of their affection. It was believed that by ingesting the sweat, the victim was literally consuming the essence of the other person, magically binding their souls and bodies together in a fit of uncontrollable lust. Other, even darker spells recorded in the inquisitorial archives involved women baking their own menstrual blood or ground up fingernails into loaves of bread for their husbands to eat, attempting to ensure fidelity. In the Middle Ages, the path to a person's heart was literally through the consumption of their bodily waste. Yet, despite this desperate scramble to secure and maintain a marriage through sweat-soaked apples and financial contracts, a significant portion of the population never married at all. We must acknowledge the economic and social reality of the single medieval woman, entirely independent of a husband. The term spinster was originally not a derogatory word for an old maid. It was a highly respected official legal occupation. Before the Industrial Revolution, spinning wool into thread was an incredibly labor-intensive bottleneck in the textile industry. It required immense skill and endless hours. Many women realized that they could support themselves entirely through the spinning trade, avoiding the lethal dangers of childbirth and the legal subjugation of coverture. In the urban centers of Northern Europe, this female independence evolved into one of the most fascinating social movements of the era, the Beguines. These were communities of single women and widows who lived together in urban compounds, beguinages. They did not take strict monastic vows, they did not answer to an abbess or a bishop, and they supported themselves through the textile trade, brewing, and nursing the sick. They built a highly successful, completely self-sufficient female microeconomy right in the middle of the patriarchal medieval city. However, this level of female independence terrified the ecclesiastical authorities. Because the Beguines were not controlled by husbands and were not locked away in convents under the authority of male priests, the church viewed them with deep suspicion, eventually accusing many of them of heresy and attempting to violently dismantle their communities in the later Middle Ages. The system could tolerate a woman as a subjugated wife or a cloistered nun, but a financially independent, single woman was viewed as a dangerous anomaly that had to be eradicated. If a woman did marry, but later sought affection outside the bonds of her husband's control, she was engaging in an act of physical and legal brinkmanship. Adultery in the Middle Ages was not merely a matter for divorce lawyers, it was a physically perilous crime. However, proving adultery required navigating the chaotic, violent mechanism of medieval law enforcement known as the hue and cry. Because there was no professional police force, law enforcement was a communal obligation. If a husband suspected his wife was with another man, he could not simply accuse her in court. He had to catch them in the act. He would wait until the lover entered his house, and then he would literally start screaming, raising the hue and cry. By law, every able-bodied man in the village was required to drop their tools, grab their weapons, and run toward the shouting. The mob would smash down the door and physically drag the naked, terrified couple out into the street as living, indisputable evidence of the crime. For the male lover, being caught in the act was a matter of life and death. Under various regional customary laws, a husband who caught another man in bed with his wife was legally permitted to kill him on the spot without facing murder charges, or, in a highly specific and brutal application of medieval justice, he was legally permitted to physically castrate the lover himself. The stakes of infidelity were astronomically high. Ultimately, every aspect of medieval relationships, from the sweaty apples of courtship to the screaming mobs of the hue and cry, from the independent spinsters to the rigidly policed marital beds, was defined by a complete and total lack of privacy. You did not own your relationship. The community owned it, the church owned it, and the feudal lord taxed it. Your affection was a commodity to be traded, your physical intimacy was a bureaucratic checklist for the local priest, and your domestic disputes were public entertainment for your neighbors. To survive a medieval relationship required an iron will, an incredibly high tolerance for humiliation, and the pragmatic understanding that love was not a private refuge from a cruel world, but simply another brutal battlefield within it. To fully understand the terrifying lengths to which medieval people went to secure a relationship, we must examine the physical lengths they went to in order to manufacture physical attraction. While we have established that a peasant's desirability was measured in muscle mass and agricultural stamina, the upper and rising middle classes were entirely consumed by a lethal obsession with aesthetics. The medieval beauty standard was rigidly defined and incredibly difficult to achieve naturally. The ideal woman possessed skin as white as snow, a massive, domed forehead, plucked eyebrows, and dilated, shining eyes. This pale complexion was paramount because it served as a direct visual indicator of class. It proved that a woman did not have to work outside in the sun. To achieve this ghostly pallor, women, and frequently aristocratic men, resorted to applying Venetian ceruse, a thick cosmetic paste made by mixing white lead with vinegar. They were literally painting their faces with a highly toxic heavy metal. Over time, the lead would eat into the skin, causing horrific scarring, hair loss, and eventual lead poisoning, which required even thicker layers of the toxic paste to hide the damage it had caused. To achieve the highly coveted, massive forehead, women would endure the agonizing process of plucking their hairlines back an inch or more, sometimes using poultices made of quicklime and bat's blood to burn the hair follicles and prevent regrowth. To make their eyes shine with a desirable deer-in-the-headlights vulnerability, they would drop the juice of the belladonna plant, deadly nightshade, directly into their pupils to dilate them, intentionally blurring their own vision and risking permanent blindness just to look appealing across a banquet hall. However, this desperate, toxic pursuit of beauty was not just a medical hazard, it was a profound theological crime. The medieval church harbored an absolute, venomous hatred for cosmetics. Preachers thundered from the pulpits that a woman wearing makeup was committing a direct insult to God, effectively telling the Creator that his work was inadequate and needed fixing. But the church's condemnation went deeper than simple vanity. It was rooted in the medieval paranoia of contractual fraud. Because marriage was a binding, lifelong legal contract, the church argued that a woman who used cosmetics was committing deliberate, malicious deception. She was tricking a man into marrying a painted illusion rather than the flawed, sinful flesh beneath. Sermons frequently compared women wearing makeup to freshly whitewashed tombs, beautiful and gleaming on the outside, but filled with rotting bones and corruption on the inside. If a medieval man discovered his new bride's beauty washed off with a wet rag on their wedding night, theologians argued he was the victim of a fraudulent transaction. In the medieval dating market, trying to look your best was synonymous with committing spiritual treason. If we shift our focus from the toxic artifice of women to the glorified image of men, we must violently dismantle the greatest romantic illusion ever produced by the Middle Ages, the chivalric knight in shining armor. Modern culture has digested centuries of Arthurian legends, presenting the knight as the ultimate romantic ideal, a gentle, poetic warrior who rescues damsels, respects women, and dedicates his life to serving his lady. The historical reality recorded in the boring, blood-stained chronicles of the era is entirely the opposite. The medieval knight was a heavily armored, highly trained, professional killer. His training began around the age of 7, ripping him away from his mother and subjecting him to years of brutal, physical conditioning and extreme violence. He was taught to ride massive war horses, wield heavy, blunt-force weapons, and slaughter other human beings for the economic and political gain of his liege lord. When this professional warlord returned home from years of campaigning, sieges, and surviving dysentery in military camps, he did not suddenly transform into a gentle poet. He brought the violence of the battlefield directly into the domestic sphere. The trauma of medieval warfare, what we would now recognize as severe PTSD, was rampant, untreated, and entirely unrecognized. Court records from the upper nobility are flooded with accounts of lords viciously beating their wives, brutalizing their servants, and ruling their manners through absolute terror. The literary concept of courtly love and the gentle, swooning knight was not a reflection of medieval reality. It was a desperate, fictional coping mechanism. The romance literature of the 12th and 13th centuries was largely commissioned and popularized by aristocratic women, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, specifically as an instructional fantasy. It was an attempt to civilize the brutes. By creating a cultural trend where a knight's honor was tied to how gently and obediently he treated a noblewoman, these women were desperately trying to socially engineer their heavily armed, traumatized husbands into something less lethal. The chivalric romance was not a documentary, it was a survival manual for noble women trapped in castles with professional killers. What happened then when this violent reality became completely unbearable, and the rigid walls of the church refused to grant an annulment? When the legal system failed, the abused, the desperate, and the trapped resorted to the ultimate medieval relationship exit strategy: murder. Because a woman was physically smaller and legally barred from owning weapons, she could not simply challenge a violent husband to a duel. Therefore, poison became known exclusively as the woman's weapon. The medieval world was overflowing with toxic flora. Hemlock, monkshood, arsenic, and ground glass were easily obtained from the local apothecary under the guise of treating rat infestations or curing ailments. A few drops of arsenic slipped into a husband's heavily spiced evening ale, or a poisonous poultice applied to a bleeding wound, was often entirely undetectable by the crude medical science of the era, easily passed off as a sudden fever or a bad case of the sweating sickness. However, the medieval legal system was acutely aware of this subterranean war within the household, and they established terrifying deterrents to protect the lives of husbands. In English common law, specifically solidified by the Treason Act of 1351, a woman murdering her husband was not classified as simple homicide. Because the husband was the legally ordained king of his household, a wife killing him was legally categorized as petty treason. She was not just killing a man, she was committing an act of rebellion against the divine hierarchical order of the universe. The punishment reflected the magnitude of this cosmic crime. While a man who murdered his wife would simply be hanged by the neck, a woman convicted of petty treason was sentenced to be burned alive at the stake. The authorities believed that only the purifying agony of fire could cleanse the ultimate sin of a wife destroying her master. The fact that medieval court records still show a steady stream of women willing to risk the agonizing, horrific death of the stake just to escape their marriages is the absolute clearest indicator of exactly how hellish and unendurable a bad medieval relationship could be. Yet, we must not assume that the crushing weight of the medieval relationship fell entirely upon women. The patriarchal system was a double-edged sword that inflicted intense, paranoid psychological damage upon the men who were forced to uphold it. A medieval man was legally and morally responsible for the behavior of every single person under his roof: his wife, his children, his apprentices, and his servants. If his wife committed a crime, accrued a massive debt, or publicly slandered a neighbor, the husband was frequently the one who had to pay the fines or stand before the magistrate, because the law considered his wife to be an extension of his own property. This absolute responsibility created an atmosphere of obsessive, suffocating control. This male anxiety manifested most acutely in the paralyzing fear of impotence and cuckoldry. In a society where a man's entire worth was tied to his ability to dominate his household and produce legitimate heirs, any failure in the bedroom was not a private embarrassment. It was a public, existential threat. We have discussed the terror of magical ligature, but this anxiety drove men to equally desperate measures of folk magic. Men would purchase expensive, illicit talismans made of dried wolf penises, consume powdered stag antlers, or carry the hearts of doves in their pockets, terrified that a momentary biological failure would result in their wives seeking satisfaction elsewhere. The medieval patriarch lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, terrified that his apprentices were seducing his maidservants, that his wife was watering down the ale, or that his neighbors were whispering behind his back. The absolute power granted to men by medieval law did not make them happy or secure. It turned them into paranoid wardens of their own domestic prisons, constantly waiting for the riot to begin. As we approach the twilight of the Middle Ages, transitioning into the 15th and 16th centuries, the rigid, ironclad structures of these relationships slowly began to crack. But not because people suddenly became more romantic. They cracked because the underlying economics of the world began to change. The rise of early capitalism, the expansion of global trade routes, and the terrifying efficiency of the printing press began to alter the social fabric. Young people moving to rapidly expanding cities to work for wages found themselves slightly less dependent on inheriting their father's muddy acre of land. The printing press allowed for the mass production of cheap ballads, romantic poetry, and eventually scandalous literature, slowly democratizing the aristocratic fantasy of love and feeding it to the literate merchant classes. The foundational, survival-based pragmatism that defined the medieval marriage was beginning to be infected by the dangerous, modern idea of personal fulfillment. However, the shadow of the medieval relationship is long, and its DNA is still buried deep within our modern institutions. The very concept of the modern wedding ceremony, the reading of the banns, the public vows, the exchange of rings on the fourth finger, the legal merging of assets, was forged entirely in the cold, transactional, and heavily regulated fires of the Middle Ages. The medieval relationship was not a fairy tale of knights and princesses. It was a grueling, lifelong endurance test played out in smoky, crowded cottages, adjudicated by paranoid priests and nosy neighbors, fueled by toxic makeup, bound by terrifying legal contracts, and haunted by the constant, looming specters of starvation, disease, and the executioner's fire. It was a dark, bloody, and boring history, but it is the exact foundation upon which every modern romance is unwittingly built. To fully grasp the suffocating bureaucratic labyrinth that was the medieval dating scene, we must examine a legal concept that modern society has entirely forgotten, yet one that absolutely paralyzed medieval courtship: spiritual affinity. The Catholic Church's obsession with regulating human intimacy did not stop at biological bloodlines or legal marriage ties. They constructed an invisible, highly volatile web of religious taboos around the sacrament of baptism. When a child was baptized, the godparents did not just take on a ceremonial role. According to canon law, they entered into a literal, spiritual blood tie with the child and the child's biological parents. This meant that if a man stood as a godfather to his neighbor's infant, he was instantly transformed into the spiritual brother of the infant's mother. Consequently, he was absolutely forbidden from ever marrying her, even if she later became a wealthy widow. Furthermore, his biological children were forbidden from marrying her biological children. In a tiny, isolated medieval village with a population of perhaps 100 or 200 people, where the same families had acted as godparents for each other for generations, this invisible web of spiritual incest essentially eradicated the legal dating pool. Finding a partner who was not a biological cousin, not an in-law, and not a spiritual sibling required a level of genealogical mathematics that baffled even the local priests. Naturally, the aristocracy immediately realized that this confusing, poorly documented theological rule was the ultimate legal weapon. Because baptismal records in the early and high Middle Ages were often merely oral traditions or hastily scribbled notes, spiritual affinity became the premier escape hatch for failed noble marriages. If a lord grew tired of his aging wife, or if she failed to produce a male heir, he didn't need to assassinate her or claim physical impotence. He simply had to bribe a few elderly peasants to testify before the bishop's court that 30 years ago, the lord's father had accidentally stood as a sponsor at the baptism of the wife's cousin. The marriage was instantly declared invalid due to undiscovered spiritual consanguinity. It was a brilliant, highly cynical loophole. The church inadvertently handed the ruling class a master key to divorce, wrapped in the guise of extreme theological purity. For the vast majority of the population who could not afford to bribe bishops, the day-to-day mechanics of courtship faced an entirely different, insurmountable barrier: absolute illiteracy. How does a young man woo a woman who lives 3 villages away when neither of them can read or write? The romanticized image of slipping a sealed love letter under a heavy wooden door did not exist for the peasantry. Instead, courtship required the perilous use of a go-between, or an intermediary. If a young blacksmith wanted to propose to a miller's daughter, he had to enlist a trusted friend, a traveling peddler, or a local widow to carry his verbal message across the county. This meant that romantic feelings were never private. They were instantly public knowledge, subject to the interpretation, the memory, and the personal agenda of the messenger. The go-between held immense power. They could embellish the suitor's wealth, lie about his intentions, or, in a scenario so common it became a staple of medieval cautionary tales, the go-between could decide they liked the target themselves and sabotage the entire arrangement for their own benefit. Even for the rising merchant class who possessed a small degree of literacy, or who could afford to hire a professional scribe in the marketplace, writing a love letter was an incredibly rigid, unromantic process. You did not simply pour your heart out onto parchment. The medieval world relied heavily on the ars dictaminis, the formalized art of letter writing. Scribes used thick manuals filled with standardized templates for every conceivable situation. If a merchant wanted to send a love letter, he would sit in a noisy public square, dictate his general intentions to a stranger, and the scribe would translate those clumsy feelings into highly formulaic, flowery Latin or vernacular prose, copying a template designed for addressing a virtuous maiden. The resulting letter was a beautiful, generic legal document entirely devoid of personal personality. Furthermore, when the letter arrived, the receiving maiden couldn't read it either. She had to take this supposedly intimate declaration of love to her local parish priest or her father's clerk to have it read aloud to her. In the Middle Ages, the expression of written love was a multi-person, heavily translated public broadcast. Finding the physical space to actually speak to a potential partner in an urban environment was equally fraught with legal peril. The medieval city was a fortress, and life was strictly governed by the sun. When the sun went down, the great city gates were locked, the heavy wooden doors of the houses were bolted shut, and the curfew bells rang. The unpaved, filth-ridden streets were plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. There were no streetlights. To enforce order, the civic authorities deployed the night watch, groups of armed men who patrolled the darkness looking for anyone breaking the curfew. In this claustrophobic environment, stepping outside after dark to meet a lover was legally classified as night walking. If a young couple was caught lingering in an alleyway or walking without a sanctioned lantern, they were not viewed as romantic rebels. They were instantly arrested under the assumption that they were thieves, prostitutes, or spies. They would be thrown into the local lockup, often a horrific, freezing stone dungeon like the Tun in London, until the morning, where they would face crippling fines and public humiliation before the magistrates. The medieval city criminalized the dark, effectively turning a midnight rendezvous into a high-stakes prison break in reverse. While the urban working class was being thrown in dungeons for walking in the dark, the absolute apex of medieval society operated under an entirely different, spectacularly hypocritical moral universe. The institution of the royal mistress was not a secret, shameful affair. It was an acknowledged, semi-official component of the aristocratic court. Kings like Henry II of England, who famously flaunted his mistress, Fair Rosamond, or the later French monarchs operated with absolute impunity. The church, which mercilessly whipped peasants for premarital sex and burned women at the stake for petty treason, conveniently turned a blind eye to the king's prolific adultery. The monarch's virility, demonstrated by a sprawling network of illegitimate children, was quietly viewed as a testament to his physical strength and fitness to rule. These royal bastards were not hidden away in shame. They were given titles, vast estates, and were used as highly valuable chess pieces in political marriages. The king essentially outsourced the concept of love and sexual pleasure to his mistresses, completely detaching it from the heavy political burden of his official marriage. The burden of this hypocrisy fell entirely, crushingly upon the medieval queen. Her role in this dynamic was deeply humiliating, yet politically vital. The queen's singular duty was to provide the legitimate, unquestionable male heir to the throne. Once that duty was fulfilled, she was expected to suffer her husband's blatant infidelities in absolute, dignified silence. If a queen threw a jealous rage or attempted to intervene against the king's mistresses, she was viewed not as a wronged wife, but as a hysterical, politically unstable woman threatening the peace of the realm. A good medieval queen swallowed her pride, focused entirely on the political advancement of her legitimate children, and maintained the cold, glittering facade of the royal household while her husband paraded his lovers through the court. The royal marriage was the ultimate manifestation of medieval pragmatism. A multi-billion-dollar corporate merger where the CEO was legally permitted to do whatever he wanted, and the primary shareholder was forced to smile and watch. To conclude the life cycle of the medieval courtship, we must return to the commoners and examine the cold, financial transaction that occurred the morning after the wedding night. In Germanic and Anglo-Saxon customary traditions, the consummation of the marriage had to be financially validated by the exchange of the Morgengabe, or the morning gift. When the sun rose after the wedding night, the husband was legally obligated to present his new wife with a substantial gift, usually money, a piece of land, or valuable livestock. This was not a romantic gesture of affection for a night well spent. It was a hard legal transaction. By accepting the morning gift, the woman was publicly acknowledging that the marriage had been physically consummated, that she had surrendered her virginity, and that she was now legally transitioning from the protective custody of her father into the absolute legal subjugation, coverture, of her husband. The morning gift served as her personal financial safety net in case of sudden widowhood, but symbolically, it was the final, inescapable lock on the cage. It perfectly encapsulates the entirety of the medieval relationship, an intense, high-stakes physical act immediately followed by the exchange of property, meticulously recorded to satisfy the relentless demands of a paranoid, survival-driven society. To fully dissect the visual and material culture of medieval courtship among the elite, we must examine the bizarre, aggressive aesthetic of the luxury goods market. While a peasant might carve a wooden spoon for his beloved, a wealthy duke or a prosperous merchant would commission an intricately carved ivory casket or a polished bone mirror case. These were the medieval equivalents of high-end Valentine's Day gifts, but the imagery carved into them was rarely tender or affectionate. The most incredibly popular motif across Europe in the 14th century was a scene known as the Siege of the Castle of Love. These carvings depicted a literal fortress defended by women, while armed knights aggressively assaulted the walls. The knights would use catapults and trebuchets, weapons of mass destruction designed to shatter stone and kill hundreds, to launch baskets of roses over the battlements. The women on the walls were shown throwing flowers back or eventually surrendering the keys to the castle. Modern observers might view this as a charming, whimsical metaphor, but in the context of the medieval patriarchal mindset, it normalized courtship as a relentless, predatory military campaign. The woman's modesty and chastity were portrayed as an enemy fortification that simply had to be battered down through sheer attrition, aggressive posturing, and financial bombardment. In the medieval luxury market, love was not a mutual partnership. It was a hostile takeover, beautifully rendered in elephant ivory. This militarized concept of romance was most publicly and violently acted out on the tournament grounds. The medieval joust is deeply embedded in our cultural consciousness as the ultimate arena for chivalric love. We picture a gleaming knight riding up to the royal box, bowing low and accepting a silk favor, a ribbon or a detached sleeve, from a beautiful noblewoman, before riding out to defend her honor. However, when we look at the financial ledgers and the medical realities of the medieval tournament, the romantic veneer shatters instantly. The tournament was essentially a highly lucrative, incredibly dangerous, unregulated sporting franchise. Knights did not enter the lists to prove their love. They entered to make money through the ransom economy. If a knight knocked his opponent off his horse, he legally won the loser's armor, weapons, and the warhorse itself, equipment that was worth the equivalent of millions of dollars today. The defeated knight would also have to pay a massive cash ransom to secure his own release. Where did the noblewoman fit into this brutal, blood-soaked economy? She was entirely a mascot. By granting a knight her favor, she was essentially providing corporate sponsorship. It elevated the prestige of the event, masking the ugly, mercenary reality of men bludgeoning each other for cash beneath a thin, glamorous veil of courtly devotion. Furthermore, the physical reality of the favored knight was utterly repulsive. After a few passes in the summer heat, wearing 60 pounds of padded gambeson, chainmail, and plate steel, the knight was completely drenched in sweat, bleeding from minor shrapnel wounds, and smelling heavily of horse sweat, rust, and fear. When he rode back to the stands to return the lady's favor, the token was often completely ruined, soaked in blood and grime. The tournament was an arena of concussions, shattered collarbones, and financial ruin, desperately dressed up as a romantic spectacle to entertain an aristocracy entirely bored by peacetime. When the performative violence of the tournament spilled over into the actual violence of daily life, the medieval legal system handled the darker sides of courtship with a horrifying, calculated pragmatism. In cases where courtship devolved into physical assault and abduction, a crime broadly categorized as raptus, the courts were primarily concerned with property damage rather than bodily autonomy. Because a virgin daughter was an incredibly valuable financial asset on the marriage market, an assault completely destroyed her economic worth to her father. If the perpetrator was caught, the secular courts frequently offered a solution that profoundly shocks the modern conscience. They would simply order the attacker to marry the victim. From the cold, bureaucratic perspective of a medieval judge, this was the most efficient way to resolve the crisis. By forcing the marriage, the damaged woman was provided for, the father was relieved of the financial burden of an unmarriageable daughter, the attacker avoided the gallows, and the community was spared the scandal of an illegitimate child. The victim's trauma and her absolute lack of consent were entirely irrelevant to the legal equation. The state essentially utilized the institution of holy matrimony as a rug under which it could sweep the most violent failures of medieval society. The marriage contract was weaponized to silence the victim and permanently chain her to her abuser, proving that the medieval justice system viewed female consent not as a fundamental human right, but as a minor, easily bypassed administrative hurdle. If a woman or a couple found themselves trapped in one of these horrific legal arrangements, or if they were forbidden from marrying by furious parents, their only option was to flee the jurisdiction of the village and the manor. They had to escape into the greenwood, the deep, uncultivated forest that covered vast swathes of medieval Europe. The forest has been highly romanticized in ballads like those of Robin Hood and Maid Marian, portrayed as a lush, green utopia of freedom, feasting, and natural love, entirely separate from the oppressive laws of the sheriff and the bishop. The boring history of the medieval forest, however, is a nightmare of exposure, starvation, and extreme violence. The woods were not a sanctuary, they were a heavily policed economic resource owned by the king. Forest law was entirely separate from common law and was notoriously brutal. Simply being caught carrying a bough or hunting a deer in the royal forest could result in blinding or mutilation. For a runaway couple, the greenwood offered no shelter, no agriculture, and no community. They were forced to scavenge for roots, sleep in damp, freezing thickets, and live in constant terror of the royal foresters and the desperate, violent outlaws who actually inhabited the woods. Eloping into the forest was essentially a form of civil death. Stripped of their legal identities and cut off from the vital food networks of the village, a runaway couple's romantic rebellion usually ended within a few weeks in a miserable, freezing death from exposure or dysentery. An equally desperate and heavily policed boundary existed for those who had surrendered their lives to the church, the men and women locked behind the walls of the cloister. Nuns and monks took absolute vows of chastity, but the ecclesiastical authorities knew perfectly well that vows alone were not enough to suppress human biology. Therefore, the architecture of medieval monasteries and convents was explicitly, aggressively designed to prevent romance. Convents were built with massive, imposing walls. The only place a nun was allowed to interact with the outside world, or speak to male visitors, was the parlor, a word derived from the French parler, to speak. But the parlor was heavily fortified. Nuns were required to stand behind thick iron grills covered with heavy black cloth, completely obstructing visual contact. They could only speak to a male relative or a priest while another older, trusted nun sat in the room to eavesdrop on the conversation. Yet, despite these extreme architectural and auditory surveillance measures, monastic elopements occurred with shocking frequency. Nuns scaled stone walls using ropes made from shredded bedsheets. Monks bribed corrupt porters to unlock the heavy oak gates at midnight. When a member of the clergy ran away to pursue a romantic relationship, it was not just a scandal, it was a massive international ecclesiastical crisis. They were considered apostates, who had literally broken a contract with God. The church utilized a vast network of informers to hunt them down. If caught, the runaway lover was dragged back to the monastery, stripped, publicly flogged in front of the entire chapter, and then locked in a solitary confinement cell, sometimes a windowless stone dungeon beneath the cloister. on a diet of bread and water for years, until their romantic rebellion was entirely crushed by isolation and malnutrition. The ultimate horrific culmination of monastic love is perfectly encapsulated in the famous, entirely true story of Peter Abelard and Heloise. In the 12th century, Abelard was a brilliant, arrogant philosopher in Paris who was hired to tutor the brilliant teenage Heloise. They fell passionately in love, conducted a massive, secret affair, and Heloise became pregnant. When her furious uncle, a powerful church official, discovered the relationship, the consequences were surgically brutal. Abelard was cornered in his bedchamber by a gang of thugs hired by the uncle and forcibly, physically castrated. The violent mutilation instantly ended his academic career and his romantic life. Heloise was forced into a convent to become a nun against her will, and Abelard became a monk. Their famous, surviving letters are often touted as the greatest love letters of the Middle Ages, but when read closely, they are a terrifying record of grief, resentment, and the absolute destruction of two lives. Heloise's letters are filled with agonizing fury that she is locked in a convent she hates, praying to a god she blames for her misery, all for a man who is now physically incapable of returning her affection. The story of Abelard and Heloise strips away all the romantic illusions of the era, showcasing the raw, terrifying violence that the medieval patriarchal system was willing to inflict upon anyone who dared to prioritize intellectual and physical love over familial control and church dogma. Finally, we must look at the women who managed to legally marry, but found themselves married to men who were constantly on the move, the vast army of camp followers. When a medieval king raised an army, it was not a neat, disciplined column of soldiers. It was a massive, sprawling, chaotic mobile city. Behind the knights and the archers walked thousands of women, the wives, the concubines, and the prostitutes of the common soldiers. For a peasant wife, staying home while her husband marched off to war often meant starving to death, as she lost the primary labor source for her farm. Therefore, she packed up whatever she could carry and walked behind the army, sometimes dragging toddlers through the mud of foreign countries. The marital life of a camp follower was the absolute bottom of the medieval hierarchy. These women marched 20 miles a day through freezing rain, hauling the army's baggage, foraging for firewood, and doing the agonizing labor of washing blood-soaked linen in freezing rivers. When the battle lines were drawn, the women and children were corralled into the baggage train at the rear. If their side lost the battle, the victorious enemy cavalry would frequently sweep through the baggage train, slaughtering the camp followers or taking them as slaves. A medieval marriage on a military campaign was an exercise in extreme, daily trauma. There was no privacy, no safety, and no guarantee that the husband they were marching behind would survive the afternoon's cavalry charge. They lived in a permanent state of mud, exhaustion, and terror, proving that for the vast majority of the population, a medieval relationship was simply a desperate, grueling partnership forged entirely for the purpose of surviving one more day in a profoundly brutal world. To fully map the bleak, transactional landscape of medieval relationships, we must examine what happened when the biological machinery of the marriage failed and left behind the most vulnerable, heavily exploited demographic in medieval society, the wealthy orphan. If a peasant died, his children were usually absorbed into the extended family or sent out as indentured servants to survive. But if a nobleman, a knight, or a wealthy landowner died leaving an underage heir, the situation triggered one of the most ruthless, predatory legal mechanisms of the feudal system, the institution of wardship. In the modern world, the death of a parent results in the appointment of a guardian to protect the child's interests. In the Middle Ages, the child and their inherited lands immediately became the physical property of their feudal overlord, or the king himself. This was not a system of benevolent foster care, it was a highly lucrative real estate market. The overlord gained the absolute legal right to manage the orphan's estates, pocketing all the profits from the harvests, rents, and mills until the child came of age. But the most valuable asset the overlord seized was the maritagium, the right to sell the child's marriage to the highest bidder. If you were an ambitious medieval baron looking to expand your territory, you didn't need to declare war. You simply went to the king and paid a massive sum of cash to purchase the wardship of a wealthy, orphaned heiress. Once you owned her wardship, you could force her to marry your own son, thereby permanently absorbing her family's lands into your own bloodline. The medieval marriage market for the elite was literally a hostage economy. Children as young as 5 or 6 were bought, sold, and traded like corporate stocks by men operating entirely out of geopolitical greed. What happened if the ward grew up and absolutely refused the arranged marriage? The law, as always, heavily favored the house. If an heir or heiress refused the partner chosen by their guardian, they were legally required to pay the guardian a massive fine equivalent to the estimated value of the marriage. If they secretly married someone else without the guardian's permission, the fine was doubled. An orphan who attempted to marry for love was instantly, legally bankrupted by the state. The wardship system perfectly encapsulates the absolute erasure of personal agency in medieval relationships. Your heart, your body, and your future were legally classified as liquid assets to be auctioned off to the highest bidder to satisfy the financial demands of the crown. If we want a perfectly preserved, excruciatingly detailed window into the daily psychological reality of an arranged medieval marriage, we must look at a surviving document from late 14th century France known as Le Ménagier de Paris, the Goodman of Paris. This is not a romantic poem. It is a meticulously written instruction manual compiled by an unnamed, elderly, wealthy Parisian bourgeois for his new bride. The husband was over 60 years old. His new wife was just 15. Knowing he would likely die soon, the husband wrote this massive book to teach his teenage bride exactly how to behave, how to manage an estate, and ultimately, how to be the perfect, obedient wife so that she would be valuable to her next husband after he was gone. The text is a chilling masterpiece of domestic subjugation masked as paternal affection. The Goodman explicitly instructs his teenage bride that she must behave toward him exactly like a faithful dog behaves toward its master. He writes, without a trace of irony, that even if a master whips his dog or throws stones at it, the dog will still follow him, wagging its tail and seeking his approval. Therefore, a good wife must endure her husband's moods and absolute authority with the exact same unthinking, desperate loyalty. He dictates every second of her day, how she must walk in the street with her eyes cast down, how she must never speak unless spoken to, and how she must manage the household servants with an iron fist. But the Ménagier also reveals the incredibly unromantic, exhausting physical reality of maintaining the marital home. The book is filled with complex recipes and frantic instructions on how to combat the terrifying lack of hygiene in the medieval city. The elderly husband provides his teenage wife with detailed recipes for trapping the massive rats that plagued their kitchen, instructions on how to cure sick falcons, and, most tellingly, multiple different methods for attempting to eradicate the swarms of fleas and bedbugs that infested their heavy woolen bedding. The medieval romantic ideal was completely suffocated by the daily, nauseating grind of domestic survival. While the troubadours sang of knights dying for a lady's glance, the reality of a wealthy urban marriage was a 15-year-old girl being lectured by a 60-year-old man on the most efficient way to spread sticky traps on parchment to catch the blood-sucking insects swarming their mattress. To escape the oppressive, flea-ridden, hyper-regulated environment of the household, the lower and middle classes sought refuge in the only communal space available to them outside the watchful eye of the parish priest, the local alehouse. In the medieval village, the tavern was the absolute epicenter of social life, gossip, and courtship. Because water was dangerous and homes were dark and claustrophobic, the alehouse offered warmth, caloric energy in the form of weak beer, and the intoxicating proximity of other young, unmarried people. However, this environment was a legal minefield. We have already established that a simple verbal promise using the verba de presenti constituted a legally binding marriage. When you combine this incredibly fragile legal threshold with poor lighting, loud music, and massive quantities of unregulated alcohol, the results were catastrophic. The church courts were absolutely swamped with alehouse marriages. A young man and woman would sit in the corner of a crowded tavern, share a heavy wooden tankard of ale, and in a drunken stupor, exchange vows in front of a few equally intoxicated friends. The next morning, the sober reality would set in. One party would panic and deny the event entirely, while the other would drag them before the bishop to enforce the contract. The courts had to desperately try to determine if the vows were spoken with true intent, or if they were merely the babbling of drunks. To combat this, the church constantly issued furious edicts forbidding couples from making marriage promises in taverns, demanding that courtship be moved back to the church porch under the sober supervision of the clergy. But the tavern remained the undisputed, chaotic heart of medieval dating, a place where a bad decision made over a cup of sour beer could permanently chain you to a stranger for the rest of your natural life. As the couple aged, surviving the alehouse traps, the horrific childbirths, the suffocating guild laws, and the plague, their relationship inevitably marched toward the absolute center of medieval culture: death. The medieval period was obsessed with the concept of the good death, ars moriendi. When a spouse finally lay dying, the surviving partner was subjected to a grueling, highly choreographed spiritual performance. The bedroom filled with priests, professional mourners, and neighbors. The spouse had to ensure that the dying partner confessed their sins, received the last rites, and forgave all debts. But the relationship did not end when the breathing stopped. It merely transitioned into a massive, panic-driven financial operation to save the deceased soul from the agonizing fires of purgatory. The medieval church taught that unless you were a canonized saint, your soul would go to purgatory to be burned and tortured until your sins were purged. The only way to shorten your spouse's torture was through the prayers of the living. This created an entire economy built on post-mortem anxiety. A grieving widow or widower would desperately pour their life savings into commissioning chantries, paying a dedicated priest to stand in a side chapel and sing masses for the soul of their dead spouse every single day, sometimes in perpetuity. Wealthy merchants would rewrite their wills, leaving massive sums of money to local monasteries, beggar guilds, or hospitals, legally binding them to chant their spouse's name during Mass. The ultimate expression of enduring medieval love was not holding on to a memory, it was bankrupting your estate to ensure your partner wasn't burning in a subterranean waiting room. For the absolute elite, this morbid obsession with mortality manifested in the most terrifying piece of relationship architecture ever conceived: the transite tomb or the cadaver monument. In the earlier Middle Ages, a wealthy couple would commission a beautiful marble or alabaster tomb featuring their effigies lying side by side, eyes open, hands clasped in eternal, peaceful prayer, looking youthful and perfect. But following the unimaginable horrors of the Black Death, the aesthetic shifted violently toward the grotesque. The transite tomb was a double-decker monument. On the top level, the couple was depicted in their glorious, worldly state, wearing heavy armor and expensive velvet gowns. But directly beneath them, on the bottom level of the tomb, the sculptor carved exact, horrifying replicas of the couple's rotting corpses. These cadaver effigies were sculpted with agonizing anatomical precision. The stone figures were depicted with their flesh sloughing off the bone, their stomachs burst open, and massive stone worms, toads, and snakes physically writhing through their rib cages and empty eye sockets. This was not the work of a deranged artist. It was specifically commissioned by the couple while they were still alive. They paid a fortune to have their own putrefying, worm-eaten corpses displayed in the middle of the parish church. It was the ultimate, brutal medieval reality check. It was a permanent, screaming message to everyone who looked at it. Romantic love, immense wealth, aristocratic titles, and physical beauty are all entirely meaningless illusions. Every political alliance, every desperate dowry negotiation, every stolen kiss in the tavern, and every drop of toxic makeup ultimately ends in the exact same dark, humiliating feast for the worms. In the boring history of the Middle Ages, the romance never ends with happily ever after. It ends in the dirt, heavily taxed by the Lord, strictly regulated by the priest, and rapidly consumed by the earth. To fully map the micropolitics of medieval affection, we must move from the heavily regulated bedchamber into the communal, highly hierarchical space of the dining hall. The modern romantic ideal often involves a candlelit dinner where a couple sits across from each other, sharing conversation over individual plates. In the Middle Ages, the concept of the individual plate simply did not exist for the vast majority of the population. Instead, dining was a communal, deeply intimate exercise in physical proximity and shared saliva. The primary dining vessel was the trencher, a thick, flat slice of 4-day-old hardened bread. Soups, roasted meats, and heavy sauces were spooned directly onto this bread. Because tableware was expensive, a medieval couple, or a knight and his favored lady at a banquet, would frequently share a single trencher. This act of eating from the same piece of bread, dipping fingers into the same communal salt cellar, and drinking from the same heavy wooden or pewter mazer cup, was a profoundly intimate ritual. In fact, medieval etiquette manuals, which were wildly popular among the rising middle classes, devoted extensive chapters to the specific manners required when sharing a trencher. A suitor was instructed to never wipe his greasy mouth on the tablecloth, to avoid blowing his nose with the hand he used to grab the meat, and, crucially, to always leave the choicest cuts of roasted swan or venison for the lady sharing his bread. At the end of the meal, the juice-soaked bread trencher was not eaten by the wealthy couple. It was collected in large baskets and thrown out into the courtyard to be fought over by the poor or fed to the lord's hunting dogs. In the medieval courtship dance, successfully navigating the greasy, shared real estate of the trencher without repulsing your partner was considered the height of courtly sophistication. However, this shared intimacy at the dinner table was entirely bound by the rigid, visible geography of medieval class and gender. In a noble household or a wealthy merchant's home, the dining hall was a physical manifestation of power. The husband, as the master of the house, sat at the high table, which was literally elevated on a wooden dais at the far end of the hall. He sat in a massive carved wooden chair, often the only chair in the entire house, which is where we get the modern term chairman. The wife, the children, the apprentices, and the servants sat below him on long backless wooden benches, the board, giving us the phrase room and board. The physical distance between the husband's elevated chair and the wife's place on the bench was a constant, visual reinforcement of the legal reality of coverture. The husband was the monarch of the dining hall. The wife, despite sharing his bed and managing his accounts, was technically just his highest-ranking subject. Yet, if we step out of the aristocratic dining hall and into the bustling, filth-ridden streets of the medieval city, we find a remarkable legal loophole that completely shattered the standard concept of the subjugated wife. While we have discussed the oppressive nature of common law, which stripped a married woman of her legal identity, the harsh, practical realities of urban capitalism forced the civic authorities to invent the concept of the femme sole, the single woman. In major trading hubs like London, York, or Paris, if a married woman ran a business entirely separate from her husband's trade, for example, if he was a blacksmith and she was a silk weaver or a global spice merchant, she could legally register with the city guild as a femme sole. By doing this, the medieval legal system essentially engaged in a convenient fiction. They pretended she was unmarried. She could sign contracts, take out massive loans, rent warehouses, sue debtors in court, and be thrown into debtor's prison independently of her husband. Why did the patriarchal medieval authorities allow this extreme level of female independence? Because it served as a vital corporate firewall. If a merchant's wife engaged in high-risk overseas trade and her ships sank, the creditors could only seize her specific assets. They could not touch her husband's blacksmith forge or his property. The femme sole status was not a victory for medieval feminism. It was an incredibly shrewd, pragmatic mechanism designed to protect the patriarch's wealth from the volatile fluctuations of the urban market. Nevertheless, the unintended consequence was the creation of a formidable class of tough, legally independent married women who navigated the cutthroat medieval economy, haggled with foreign merchants, and commanded their own commercial empires while their husbands hammered iron across town. Regardless of whether a wife was an independent merchant or a peasant working the plow, every single medieval marriage was subjected to the ultimate, inescapable surveillance tool, the confessional. In the year 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of Europe by decreeing that every Christian must confess their sins to their local parish priest at least once a year, usually right before Easter. This edict effectively inserted the priest as a mandatory, highly invasive third party into every relationship. The priest was armed with the penitentials, manuals that provided a vast, granular checklist of sins to interrogate his parishioners about. This process weaponized theology within the domestic sphere. Husbands and wives were separated in the dark, whispering their most intimate failures, resentments, and sexual activities into the ear of a man who lived right down the street. Did the wife use a love potion? Did the husband commit the sin of onan, interrupting intercourse to avoid conception? Did they harbor anger toward their in-laws? The confessional created an environment of profound psychological control. While the priest was bound by the seal of confession not to reveal what he heard, he was still the ultimate arbiter of the couple's spiritual survival. Furthermore, spouses frequently utilized the confessional to report indirectly on each other, framing their own sins in a way that highlighted their partner's cruelty or neglect. In a world with no marriage counselors, no therapists, and no privacy, the local clergyman acted as the absolute, terrifying referee of the marital soul, holding the power to assign crippling penances, like public whipping or months of fasting, based entirely on the whispered secrets of the bedroom. When the marriage inevitably produced its primary objective, children, the relationship entered its most physically dangerous and emotionally devastating phase. The modern perception of the Middle Ages, heavily influenced by the controversial 20th century historian Philippe, suggests that medieval parents did not truly love their children or mourn their deaths because infant mortality was so astronomically high. The boring, heartbreaking reality found in the archives proves exactly the opposite. Medieval parents loved their children with a fierce, desperate intensity, and the environment they had to raise them in was a literal death trap. The physical reality of a medieval peasant infant was defined by the swaddling band. For the first several months of life, babies were tightly wrapped in long strips of linen, immobilizing their arms and legs completely. While modern medicine views this as a comforting technique, the medieval purpose was brutally pragmatic. The cruck house was incredibly dangerous. The central hearth was an open fire pit with no protective grate, sharp agricultural tools leaned against the walls, and hungry pigs, dogs, and chickens roamed freely across the dirt floor. Because the mother had to work, spinning, brewing, or tending the fields, she could not constantly hold the baby. A swaddled infant was essentially a rigid, easily transportable package. Mothers would literally hang the swaddled baby from a wooden peg on the wall, or suspend them from a hook on the ceiling rafters, dangling them out of reach of the snapping jaws of the livestock and the creeping flames of the hearth. When the child grew old enough to escape the swaddling bands and began to toddle, the coroner's rolls, the legal documents recording accidental deaths, become a nightmare of parental grief. The archives are filled with visceral, meticulously detailed accounts of tragedy. A 2-year-old falling into a vat of boiling ale while the mother turned her back for 5 seconds. A toddler wandering into the muddy street and being crushed by a runaway ox cart. A child drowning in a shallow drainage ditch. The legal scribes who recorded these events frequently noted the absolute, hysterical devastation of the parents who discovered the bodies. This relentless proximity to sudden death heavily defined the emotional bond between the husband and wife. A medieval marriage was a partnership forged in the crucible of continuous, shared trauma. The physical tokens of this parental grief were enormous and desperate. If a child fell deathly ill, peasant parents would engage in the practice of measuring. They would take a string, measure the exact height and width of the dying child, and then coat that string in wax to create a life-sized, crude wax effigy. They would carry this massive, eerie wax replica of their child to the local shrine, leaving it at the altar of a saint, begging for divine intervention. If the child died, the couple was expected to process their grief rapidly, burying the infant in the crowded churchyard and returning to the fields the very next morning, because the relentless cycle of the harvest waited for no one's sorrow. The survival of a medieval relationship relied entirely on the couple's ability to absorb unimaginable loss, compartmentalize their devastation, and return to the freezing mud to ensure that the children who managed to survive the open hearths and the plague did not succumb to the winter famine. To fully comprehend the fragility of the medieval marital bond, we must examine the one catastrophic event that could physically sever a couple without requiring the intervention of a bishop, an assassin, or the executioner's fire: the diagnosis of leprosy. In the medieval consciousness, leprosy, Hansen's disease, was not just a bacterial infection. It was viewed as a physical manifestation of profound spiritual corruption, a curse from God that required absolute, unforgiving quarantine. When a husband or wife began to show the telltale signs, the loss of sensation in the extremities, the thickening of the skin, the collapse of the nasal cartilage, their relationship did not simply end. It was subjected to one of the most chilling, macabre rituals ever devised by the medieval church: the separatio leprosorum, or the Mass of Separation. When the diagnosis was confirmed by a panel of priests and physicians, the afflicted spouse was forced to undergo a literal funeral for the living. The leper was brought to the parish church and made to stand inside an open grave, or sometimes covered with a black pall used for corpses, while the priest read the Catholic burial service over them. The priest would then cast 3 handfuls of graveyard dirt upon the afflicted spouse's feet, officially declaring them dead to the world but alive to God. Following this living funeral, the priest would read a terrifying list of prohibitions. The leper could never again enter a church, a tavern, or a mill. They could never wash their hands in a stream. They could never speak to a healthy person unless standing downwind, and they were required to carry a wooden clapper or a bell to loudly announce their infectious presence. They were then physically cast out of the village, banished to a leprosarium, leper colony, situated beyond the town walls. But what happened to the healthy spouse left behind? According to the strict, unbreakable dogma of canon law, the marriage was still legally valid. Leprosy did not dissolve the sacred bond of holy matrimony. Therefore, the healthy partner was plunged into an agonizing, lifelong limbo. They were legally forbidden from remarrying, yet physically barred from ever touching or living with their spouse again. Some spouses, driven by profound devotion or a desire for extreme religious martyrdom, voluntarily chose to follow their afflicted partners into the squalor of the leper colonies, permanently condemning themselves to the margins of society. The vast majority, however, simply returned to their empty homes, legally chained to a living ghost. The diagnosis of leprosy highlights the absolute rigidity of the medieval system. The Church prioritized the abstract, theological permanence of the marriage contract over the physical, emotional, and economic survival of the human beings trapped inside it. If the massive separation represents the absolute darkest, most morbid end of the relationship spectrum, we must pivot to the chaotic, fiercely biological rituals of its beginning, the pagan carryovers of seasonal courtship. While the Church demanded that all courting be done under the sober supervision of the clergy, the peasantry operated on a timeline dictated entirely by agriculture and ancient folklore, culminating in the explosive, unregulated festivities of May Day. As the agonizing, freezing starvation of the winter finally broke, the arrival of spring triggered a massive, desperate release of psychological tension. On the eve of May 1st, the youth of the village would engage in the tradition of going a-maying. They would literally abandon the village, running off into the deep woods to spend the entire night unsupervised, gathering green branches and wildflowers. The next morning they would drag a massive, freshly cut tree trunk back into the center of the village, erect it in the square, and decorate it with ribbons to create the maypole. Modern suburbanites view the maypole as a quaint, innocent historical dance. The medieval church, however, viewed the maypole exactly for what it was: a gigantic, unapologetic phallic symbol erected in the middle of the parish to celebrate explosive, unrestrained human fertility. The Puritan writers of the later eras would furiously describe the May Day woods as a den of absolute iniquity, where young men and women spent the night engaging in illicit, premarital sex on beds of moss. And the parish birth records from the era brutally confirmed their suspicions. In many medieval and early modern villages, there was a massive, statistically undeniable spike in illegitimate births and hasty shotgun weddings exactly 9 months after May Day. The medieval peasant understood that life was short, the winter was deadly, and the church was oppressive. Therefore, the ancient, biological imperative of the spring woods frequently overwhelmed the terrifying threats of eternal damnation. When a couple moved from the chaotic fertility of the May Day woods into the structured reality of the marital home, the entire balance of power within the relationship was crystallized in a single heavy piece of material culture: the chatelaine or the ring of keys. In a medieval household, nothing of value was left out in the open. Because hunger was a constant threat, and servants or apprentices were frequently underpaid and underfed, theft was an ever-present danger. Therefore, the flour, the sugar, the spices, the salted meats, the linens, and the silver spoons were all kept in heavy, oak chests secured by massive iron locks. The person who held the keys to these locks controlled the absolute lifeblood of the household. In the medieval domestic hierarchy, the husband legally owned the physical chests, but the wife possessed the keys. She wore them visibly on her belt, a loud, jingling testament to her authority. This act of entrusting the keys was the ultimate, physical manifestation of a husband's trust. The wife was the warden of the calories and the manager of the wealth. This dynamic was so deeply ingrained in the culture that if a medieval marriage completely broke down, the ultimate, most devastating insult a husband could inflict upon his wife was to physically confiscate her keys. If a man took his wife's keys and gave them to a servant, his mother, or a mistress, it was a public declaration that the wife had been entirely stripped of her domestic authority and reduced to the status of a useless boarder in her own home. In extreme cases, wives actually sued their husbands in the ecclesiastical courts purely for the return of their household keys, viewing the confiscation as a form of extreme marital cruelty. In the Middle Ages, trust was not an abstract emotional concept. It was heavily forged in iron and locked around the wife's waist. To fill the emotional voids created by these highly transactional, power struggle-ridden marriages, aristocratic and wealthy urban women frequently turned to a bizarre, living substitute for human affection: the lapdog. While working peasants kept dogs strictly for hunting, herding, or guarding property, Noblewomen selectively bred incredibly tiny, completely useless dogs specifically to carry in their sleeves or hold in their laps. Modern viewers might assume this was simply a cute pet, much like today. However, in the context of the medieval castle, the lapdog served a deeply psychological and supposedly medical purpose. Because noblewomen were frequently separated from their own children, who were sent away to wet nurses or other households to foster, and because their marriages were cold, political alliances with men who were often absent on military campaigns, the lapdog was the only creature in the castle upon which a woman could safely and unconditionally lavish maternal affection without threatening the political hierarchy. But the lapdog was also a biological shield. Medieval medical treatises and household manuals actively advised women to keep small, warm-blooded dogs in their laps and in their beds because it was widely believed that the swarms of fleas and lice that infested medieval clothing and bedding preferred the higher body temperature of the dog to that of the human. The romanticized, pampered medieval lapdog was essentially a breathing, furry pest trap. The lady loved her dog, but she also fully expected it to absorb the biting insects so she didn't have to. Finally, we must examine the men who fueled the entire medieval illusion of romance: the troubadours and wandering minstrels. We have previously established that courtly love was a coping mechanism for noblewomen, but we must look at the cynical, brutal gig economy of the men who actually wrote the songs. Troubadours were rarely wealthy lords moonlighting as poets. They were essentially freelance public relations agents and entertainers heavily reliant on the patronage of the wealthy. They traveled from castle to castle, writing agonizingly beautiful, highly personalized love poems dedicated to the lady of the house. But the motivation was entirely mercenary. The troubadour wrote a poem praising the lady's ethereal beauty and unmatched virtue specifically so the lord of the castle would pay him in gold, fine clothes, or a warm bed for the winter. It was a transaction. The poet provided the castle with cultural prestige and entertainment, and the lord provided the poet with survival. But what happened if the lord refused to pay, or if the poet was insulted by the hospitality? The troubadour possessed a terrifying weapon. He would write a servant, a vicious, highly structured, rhyming poem of absolute slander. The poet would compose a song detailing the lord's cowardice in battle, or heavily implying that the lady of the house was sleeping with the stable hands, and he would teach this song to other wandering musicians. Because there was no print media, this oral poetry was the medieval equivalent of a viral smear campaign. A disgruntled troubadour could permanently destroy a noble family's reputation across 3 kingdoms within a month. The beautiful, sweeping romantic poetry of the Middle Ages was always backed by the implicit, terrifying threat of weaponized gossip. The men singing of eternal, pure love in the great halls were simply hustling for their next meal, entirely ready to burn the castle's reputation to the ground if the coin purse was too light. To fully grasp the inescapable, claustrophobic reality of a medieval relationship, we must examine the absolute pinnacle of marital success for the aristocracy, the royal birthing chamber. We have established that a queen's sole purpose was to produce a male heir, but the actual mechanics of this biological duty were treated as a matter of high-stakes national security. When a medieval queen was roughly a month away from her due date, she entered a terrifying, highly ritualized state known as confinement. She would retreat into her bedchamber, and the doors would be quite literally sealed. To protect the unborn heir from the deadly miasmas, bad air, that physicians believed carried disease, every single window was shuttered, locked, and covered with heavy tapestries. The keyholes were stuffed with cloth. Fresh air and natural sunlight were completely banished. The room was illuminated only by the flickering, oxygen-consuming light of beeswax candles and heated by a massive, roaring fireplace, regardless of whether it was the dead of winter or the sweltering heat of August. Inside this suffocating, dark, and unimaginably stuffy velvet box, the queen was locked away with her ladies-in-waiting and midwives. No men were allowed inside. But the paranoia of the medieval state dictated that the birth could not truly be private. The entire kingdom's political stability rested on the absolute certainty that the baby born in that room was the legitimate heir, and not a substitute smuggled in via a warming pan to replace a stillborn child or a useless daughter. Therefore, while the men were locked out, the room was packed with dozens of high-ranking noblewomen serving as hostile, eagle-eyed witnesses. These women were often the wives of rival barons, meticulously watching the queen's agony to ensure no sleight of hand occurred. The royal marital relationship was thus reduced to its most brutal, biological core. the wife was locked in an airtight, sweltering room, forced to perform the agonizing, life-threatening labor of childbirth as a public spectacle for the political enemies of her husband. If we descend from the suffocating velvet of the royal chamber back down to the mud of the village, we find that the daily communication within a commoner's marriage was policed with a horrifying, mechanical brutality. The medieval legal system possessed a specific criminal charge designed entirely to enforce the domestic subservience of wives, the crime of being a common scold. If a woman was perceived as arguing too loudly with her husband, nagging him, or generally causing a verbal nuisance in the neighborhood, it was not dismissed as a private marital dispute. It was treated as a severe breach of the king's peace. The patriarchal society viewed a vocal, argumentative wife as a terrifying subversion of the natural order that had to be physically crushed. The punishment for being a scold was visceral and degrading. The offending wife would be dragged before the manor court and sentenced to wear the scold's bridle, or the branks. This was a heavy iron cage that locked entirely around the woman's head. Protruding into the mouth was a flat piece of iron, sometimes covered in sharp spikes, that pressed down forcefully on the tongue, physically preventing her from speaking. If she tried to move her jaw, the spikes would lacerate her mouth. Once locked into this iron muzzle, her own husband or the local constable would attach a lead rope to the cage and drag her through the center of the village. The community would line the streets to jeer, throw rotting vegetables, and spit at her. The medieval legal system literally weaponized blacksmithing to physically silence women who dared to express anger or frustration within their marriages, turning domestic discipline into a horrific ironclad public parade. Yet, even for couples who avoided the iron bridles and managed to find moments of genuine affection, the physical reality of medieval intimacy was heavily impacted by the era's terrifying lack of dental and medical hygiene. Modern romance relies heavily on the cinematic, passionate kiss. In the Middle Ages, kissing was a biologically hazardous activity. While the peasantry actually had surprisingly decent teeth because they could not afford the newly imported tooth-rotting luxury of processed sugar, their breath was an entirely different story. The medieval diet relied heavily on pungent onions, garlic, and salted fish. Furthermore, chronic diseases like scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C during the endless winter months, resulted in bleeding, putrefying gums. To combat this, the wealthy went to desperate lengths to manufacture a kissable mouth. Medical treatises of the era provided recipes for breath mints made of crushed cloves, aniseed, cardamom, and cinnamon mixed with honey. Aristocrats chewed on fennel seeds or rubbed their teeth with sage leaves and heavily acidic wine to strip away the plaque. But for the vast majority of the population, a kiss was a raw, unfiltered exchange of medieval reality. When you combine the lack of running water, the infrequency of bathing, the heavy woolen clothing steeped in wood smoke and sweat, and the untreated halitosis, the physical closeness of a medieval relationship was an assault on the senses. Intimacy required a profound, pragmatic tolerance for the stench of human survival. It was not a fragrant, perfumed affair. It was the raw, unwashed collision of two people simply trying to find warmth in a freezing, filthy world. This intense physical reality was inextricably linked to the medieval obsession with biological proof. The legal and theological validity of a marriage rested entirely on the physical act of consummation. But in many parts of medieval Europe, particularly in the Mediterranean and southern regions, the community did not simply trust the couple's word. They required forensic evidence. This resulted in the deeply invasive morning-after ritual of displaying the bedsheets. When the sun rose after the wedding night, the female relatives of both the bride and the groom would enter the bedchamber to inspect the linens. They were looking for the specific bloodstains that proved the bride's virginity had been taken and the marriage successfully consummated. These stained sheets were then frequently hung out the window or draped over the balcony for the entire village to witness. If the sheets were clean, the consequences were catastrophic. The groom's family could instantly demand an annulment, claiming they had been sold damaged goods. The bride would be disgraced, her family's honor destroyed, and her dowry forfeited. This extreme, public reduction of a woman's worth to a spot of blood on a piece of laundry drove desperate medieval brides to the illicit, subterranean economy of anatomical counterfeiting. Medical manuals from the era, such as the widely circulated Trotula, contained secret, highly guarded recipes used by midwives to help fallen women fake their virginity. They used astringent herbs, crushed glass, or small sponges soaked in pigeon or sheep's blood, hidden inside the body, to ensure that the sheets would be sufficiently stained on the wedding night. The medieval marriage bed was a crime scene waiting to be investigated, and the bride was forced to act as both the victim and the forensic architect of her own survival. When the marriage finally came to its inevitable end, the performance of grief was just as heavily regulated and weaponized as the performance of virginity. When a husband died, the surviving widow was thrust into the highly policed visual economy of widow's weeds. Mourning was not a private emotional state, it was a strict, legal uniform. A widow was required by sumptuary laws to dress entirely in heavy, coarse black wool. She was forced to wear a barb, a piece of stiff, pleated white linen that covered her neck and the lower half of her face, effectively erasing her identity and signaling her complete withdrawal from the sexual and social marketplace. This performance of grief was not optional. If a wealthy widow failed to wear her mourning clothes long enough, or if she was seen attending a festival or laughing too soon after her husband's death, the consequences were terrifying. The husband's furious blood relatives would immediately petition the courts, accusing her of having poisoned him or plotted his death with a secret lover. Because women were inherently viewed as treacherous and lustful by medieval theology, any failure to perform absolute, crushing despair was taken as an admission of guilt. The widow had to visually prove, through months of isolation and suffocating black wool, that she was truly broken by the loss of her master. If she successfully navigated this grueling theatrical performance, she might finally secure her inheritance and the prized femme sole status. Thus, the life cycle of the medieval relationship, from the bloody sheets of the wedding night to the heavy black veils of the funeral, was a continuous, exhausting public performance, carefully engineered to satisfy the relentless paranoia of a society that trusted absolutely no one.